What's up? Another episode of Ripple Effect Podcast. I'm your host, Ricardo Verendez, and today we got a great show. I met up with a friend of the show, Hunter Maats, author of The Straight A Conspiracy, host of Mixed Mental Arts with Bryan Callen, which some of you guys might know from the Joe Rogan podcast, and also the other podcast he does, which is The Fighter and the Kid with Brennan and Schaub. And I went down, he ended up being in Massachusetts for a week, and I found some time to drive down there after work and meet up with him. And it was a little bit of a drive, but it was worth it. We ended up recording a 3-hour podcast right on my phone. I think the quality was still pretty damn good for being on a phone. I have a podcast app that you can record podcasts on, and we didn't even know if we were going to use it, but we ended up talking for probably 4 hours, but ended up recording like 3 of it. And I think it ended up being an amazing, great conversation. There's something about being in person with a guest that you just can't capture on Skype and through internet conversation. So it was just a really cool conversation. It's always cool to meet people and become friends with people that I've met in this podcast community. This journey has been so much fun, and meeting people like Hunter Maats is truly a pleasure. So even though it was like a 2-hour drive there, and then with traffic, probably like a 2.5-hour drive, 3-hour drive back, to do a 3-hour podcast, a lot of driving one day. But you know what? When you're passionate about something and you love doing something, which I absolutely do, sometimes you make sacrifices like that. And it was well worth it because we got to capture an amazing conversation, and hopefully it's online forever. So, it's cool to archive these conversations and be able to share them. So we talked about everything and anything. I mean, I can't even start to tell you what we talked about. We talked about so many personal stories and things that have influenced our lives and personal opinions on so many different topics. It's just really a blast. We talked about so many different things. So get your pen and pencil out, because we reference, especially Hunter referenced, tons of really interesting people and articles and research and authors and books that have been influential to him. So if you want to write some of those down and check them out, please do. And check out his podcast, Mixed Mental Arts. And also Hunter is going to be, which we talk about on our podcast, I put together, I'm going to do hopefully more of these, but this is the very first one. It's going to be called the Ripple Effect Roundtable Debate, and it's going to be with Hunter Maats, who's obviously my guest here and been on the show before, and also another past guest, Adam Kokesh, which some of you guys might know from Adam vs. the Man, from the Joe Rogan podcast, from RT, he's been on so many different shows and done so many different things. He has a really popular YouTube channel, really popular libertarian author, wrote a book called Freedom, and just really smart, fun guy to talk to. So if you haven't heard my interview with him, check him out. Obviously, you're listening to the Hunter Maats conversation on this episode, so you get an idea of who the two guests are, but going to get them together. Hopefully have a really interesting debate and conversation. I'm calling it a debate, but really I just hope it's just a conversation where we can challenge each other's ideas. And well, I'm not challenging anybody's ideas, because these guys are black belts, and I'm a white belt compared to these guys. So I'm going to be here just to kind of listen to both perspectives and input anything I can, and maybe get these guys to expand on any interesting ideas that I might not understand or want to hear more about. So, and get these guys to challenge each other a little bit, because I love seeing two really intelligent people go at it and challenge each other's ideas, because from a host, I'm going to grow and learn a lot from it. From the listener's perspective, I hope you guys do the same. And that's what the show's about, trying to share interesting ideas. And I think there's a desire to not just hear all different perspectives, but to also challenge them, and not just be an echo chamber where we all just agree with each other and we only talk to people that agree with us. So with that said, also remember to support the show on Patreon. I really appreciate it. If you can't do that, then rate the show, share the show, retweet the show, do all that stuff, and that goes a long way. So, that's another way that you can help without financially having to contribute. Also, Theory 6 Music, it's all the music you hear. You can download anywhere where there's digital downloads, and that's another way all that money goes right to the podcast and to my project. So those are 2 ways to do it. And like I said, also share and follow us on Twitter and all that stuff. We have a Facebook page. I now have an Instagram. So if you want to see selfies and a bunch of other ridiculous, probably pointless stuff that we share on Instagram, then do that. It's RV Theory 6, which is also my Twitter handle, and our YouTube channel. So this podcast the debate, the one that's what I'm referring to now. The debate should be out the first weekend in August, so look out for it. And we might do it live, so follow us on social media and see if we do end up doing that, and we end up sharing a link so you can watch live. But if not, hopefully we'll have it out by the first weekend of August, which is Saturday the 5th and 6th. So keep a lookout for that. And I think that's it for now. Thanks again, guys. Always appreciate you guys downloading and listening, and enjoy this amazing podcast and conversation I had with the powerful Hunter Maats. Thanks, guys. Peace.
You're gonna fuck up your kids. The question is how.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And what me and my buddy were talking about recently, it was, I was talking to him, like, isn't it fucking amazing how important, like, so you're talking about, like, your birth to your adolescence years, like, it's such a small portion of your life, it's whatever, if you live till 100, it's, maybe freaking 15 to 20% of your life, and, but yet, that stuff that happens then affects you forever, where when you look at, like, stuff that happens to you in your 30s, like, I did shit in my 20s that I'm like, I can't remember, like, it didn't scar me forever, but there's shit that happened that seems much more mild or minimal or not as important that happened to me as a kid that, like, still scars me and still affects me emotionally or the way I think or look at things, and it's like, it's so important. So, like, when you're a parent, it's like, it's crazy because a lot of stuff that you don't realize is a big deal now, eventually your child could be older and be like, listen, Dad, you fucked me up by doing that, so that's scary, and it's hard to kind of analyze and sometimes overthink what you're doing or how you do things. Like, for example, I don't know if I ever told you this, but I'm a twin, and my mother always had, like, I always remember my mother being stressed all the time. And I couldn't remember specifics, but I remember my mother being stressed. And as I got older, I would ask my parents, I would ask relatives, I'm like, was my mother fucking crazy when I was younger? Like, well, what am I recalling? And a lot of it was, my mother says, I was by myself and I didn't have any help, and it was twins. One would stop crying, the other would start crying, and she's like, yeah, so maybe I was stressed out a lot, this and that. And I'm like, and it's crazy because I sensed that and I felt that. And I remember when me and my wife were pregnant with our son, my first child, I told her, I'm like, listen, whatever happens, we're not getting stressed. And I'm like, he senses it, even if we think he isn't. I'm like, he's feeling it, and he and I don't want him to remember this the same way I remember it. And so I thought about it over and over again, and I think I thought about it so much, and I prepared myself for it so much that, like, my son, I almost feel like it was boot camp the first 3 months. Like, literally all he did was cry. Yeah. And I spent hours and hours in our kitchen and our living room, like, rocking him, singing him. Like, you don't realize how many songs you don't know the lyrics to until you're, like, just trying to sing to him. And I'm like, fuck, man, I need another song. I'm like, I don't know lyrics to any songs apparently. And just coming up with whatever I could, trying everything, and he would not stop crying. But I always stayed patient and calm, and because I didn't want the same thing to happen to him, and, like, have, like, the sense, that stress, and it's just one of those things where just, like, it makes you wonder, like, okay, as he gets older, handling, how do we discipline him? Can we over discipline him? Should we discipline him at all? And what is disciplining? And what are the benefits and the pros and cons of it? And there's so, I think I told you I suggested somebody for you to talk to. She's a professor of psychology at Notre Dame, who I actually heard because she was on Christopher Ryan's podcast. And I'd seen her name, I think she was somewhere else too, a while ago, talking about epigenetics or something like that. But then I heard her on Christopher Ryan's podcast, and I really liked what she was talking about. And maybe the first time I heard her, I wasn't a parent yet, and now she was talking about stuff that I could relate to, and it could be beneficial to me. She was talking about letting a kid cry it out, and all these things, like these long-term effects, and all these, basically going back, I think Chris called it primal parenting is what he called the episode, because that's what she was kind of talking about, how our ancestors, or our primal ancestors, and how people on the Amazon, how they parent, and how we've gotten so far away from that. From, like, it takes a tribe. Everybody was a part of the parenting, and which kind of makes sense, because I remember thinking about that. I'm like, my mom was one of 7, my dad's one of 12, and I'm like, I have 2 kids, and I can't even imagine having more. It's just so much work, and it takes so much time and effort and love and energy that I might not even have to share with everybody. And then you realize, like, the thing about those big families is that it wasn't just like today, all the burden's on the parents. Like,
That's right.
The parents have to do everything. You know, like, you don't know your neighbors, your other you know, whatever family you have that lives locally, they're off doing their shit, so they don't have time helping you out with anything. So, like, you know, when you have kids, like, the majority of the burden's on you. Where, like, back then it was different. Like, my dad is the youngest, I believe, and his siblings were having kids before he was born. So they were taking care of one another. They had siblings that had kids his age, and, like, basically a lot of the family was just taking care of themselves. And I think that's kind of has a little bit to do with you know, when you talk to older generations, they're like, oh, we're more mature at this age than you were. I'm like, probably because you're taking care of kids already, you know, and we aren't, you know. And so I think that, you know, a lot of that is really important. This you know, just this idea of, like, everybody helping out with the progression of the children and helping, and it takes some of the burden off the mother and the father. And
well, it's also realizing that having two people be entirely responsible for a child is actually quite unnatural. It seems natural because of our culture and because of what we've gotten used to, right? So you're like, oh, that's the model, right? And that's what culture does. It binds and blinds. So it makes you think this is the way that it's always done. Until you start to look around at what other cultures do, right? And, you know, you have the advantage of sort of sitting between a bunch of different worlds because you have this Portuguese experience, you have this, you know, sort of seeing American experience, you've seen some other cultures. But if you really look back at hunter-gatherer tribes and how they deal with this primal parenting that Chris is talking about, you know, it's the whole village is doing it. So even, like, we had a friend of ours down here who just had a baby, right? And she's responsible for breastfeeding this child. Now, the point is that then becomes a full-time job for her.
Yes, it does, yeah.
But if you had a tribe of 150 women, 150 people, and then, you know, probably multiple members of that tribe are pregnant at any one time, then it's like, you know, the breastfeeding is probably being shared, right? And on top of that, the parenting is being shared. So it's like, oh, okay, we're going to go out gathering. Meanwhile, you know, this person is going to watch a bunch of people's kids. And so it becomes this shared responsibility. And in fact, the example, one of the examples that Chris Ryan uses in Sex at Dawn, which I love, is of the Ache tribe, where in fact children are considered to have many fathers. So the Ache believe that the way that a baby is formed is that all the sperm adds up, and it just sort of builds out the baby layer by layer. So the women try and have sex with as many men as possible during their pregnancy, and they seek out the men. Oh, that one's a good storyteller. Oh, that one's a good hunter. That one's
traits.
All the traits.
Yeah.
But the result is that if you talk to an Ache child and you say, "Who's your father?" he's confused. A singular father? No, of course not. I have these 12 fathers, and they all have a role in taking care of the kid, even though we now know genetically it's only one of the fathers. And so, you know, that's...
So at that time, like, for example, because it's been a long time since I read Sex at Dawn.
Yeah.
And, but I'm not even sure if he talks about this in the book, but, like, so what... Because you didn't have DNA tests, how would somebody ever know who the father was anyways? You just didn't, right?
Well,
so
but they didn't
just,
even...
It wasn't important to them. It wasn't...
Well, they didn't... I mean, the point is that people have stories they tell about how these things happen. And so, for example, you know, things that we now take for granted. We take for granted there's a sperm, there's an egg, right? They meet, a baby is, you know, begins to be formed, and then it sort of essentially, you know, gestates over the process of 9 months. Hunter-gatherer cultures don't know or understand any of these parts of this process, right? So for many of them, they don't understand that sex is connected to pregnancy, necessarily, or that the gestation period is 9 months. So there's another famous story about an Aboriginal tribe in Australia, and these anthropologists were working with it, and this guy had been away for 2 years, right, this Aboriginal guy. And then he comes back and he finds out that his wife has had a baby, right? And, you know, just had a baby or is like, you know, super pregnant or whatever, and he's so excited. And the Westerners are in this uncomfortable position of knowing that the wife has been sleeping around. It couldn't possibly be his child because the timeline doesn't work out. but his culture hasn't yet figured out what the timeline is for a pregnancy, so it doesn't even occur to him that that might be an issue. So a lot of these concepts that we take for granted, there's like the raw mechanics of it they just don't even know about yet. And they also, as a result, they have totally different conceptions of paternity, right? The Nepalese, for example, it's either the Nepalese or the Tibetans, but their cultural trait was that when a stranger would come through town, you would beg the stranger or you would invite the stranger to sleep with all the women, because you wanted genetic diversity. That was sort of the problem for them up in these remote mountain villages. But so again, there the intuitions around sex were like, oh great, total stranger is here, let's have him sleep with our daughters. So cultures have very, very different norms around sex, parenting, relationships, and I'm not going to advocate for any one or the other, but I think that even that is helpful to start to get you to think about like what actually makes sense. And I think, now that a lot of my friends are having kids, I think that the expectation of having two people be entirely responsible for, a set of children is just like, I don't think it's healthy, right? It isn't. Yeah. It's such a huge burden.
It's funny you say that, because one thing that I find is really important is we constantly have friends over the house, and my kids, initially they were really attached to us, and we're like, we need to have friends over more often. They can't just constantly be attached to us as much. I'm like, it's important for them to have relationships with all these people who are also important in our lives, you know? And they'll be a part of their lives. And as time went by, they get excited when certain friends come over the house, and then if we need to leave the house for a little bit, and they'll stay with them, and it's it's cool, because it's everybody's a part of this process of these kids growing up, and then all these people are going to be a part of their lives, and there's probably things that our kids are going to get from their mother, from their father, but also from their uncles and aunts and cousins and friends, and maybe certain conversations that they'll have with certain people that they might not have with me, which sticks with them forever. And so the more avenues they can go down, and more perspectives and good positive people you can put around them, you figure it can only be positive. It can only turn out well,
And that's what you want, right? I mean, when you think about what do you want for your kids, you want them to have lots of great role models, lots of positive role models who, it's like there are, I have some bad news for my unborn children, but I'm currently not the person to teach them to fish. I'll go out fishing with them, but I can already think of the guy I know, Fraser, and we're going to be like, let's hook up with Fraser, kids. We're all going to go out with Fraser. We're going to learn how to fish. I'm going to learn with you, so you're going to see me struggling to learn this thing so that it's okay for you to not know, and we're all going to learn what Fraser has to teach us. And that's what I would want for my kids, is learn from me, but learn from everybody. And you have to understand that that's what humans are set up to do. That's what happens in a village, is that you look around at the adults and the elders, and they have lots of different skills, and you're constantly picking up what are the things you can learn from everyone. And then, because you have all of these different diverse things, then they germinate in your head, they have idea sex, and that's how you innovate. Because you make connections and combinations that nobody has ever seen before.
Yeah. That goes to that conversation of, people are always saying, well, when you write a song, where does it come from? Where does creativity come from? And I think a lot of it is just like you said, you take in as much information, it's a bunch of puzzle pieces, and your brain just constantly putting them together. And then when I've heard even Rogan talk about it recently with, I think Dorian Yates, when they're talking about where creativity comes from, and they're talking about psychedelics, and how a lot of people have this idea that it comes from somewhere else, you're tapping into something. But it could be, I don't know, but I also think it would make a lot of sense that, okay, I listen to a lot of music, I read poetry, I read books, I watch documentaries, this and that, so I'm constantly consuming all this information, and then when I'm trying to come up with something creative, all that information is just kind of in a tornado in my head, and then when things make sense, when two puzzle pieces, it's like Tetris, all of a sudden you find the right piece that fits in the right place, and all of a sudden you're like, bing, and you're like, oh, where did this come from? Well, all it was just this gathering of stuff, and then all of a sudden I found something that fit together. And that's what it was. It doesn't necessarily, I don't necessarily think it comes from some magical place that, I'm tapping into, I take DMT and all of a sudden, I get this antenna on my head that's tapping into this, which it's fine if you believe that, and I've never done DMT, so it's hard for me to...
Yeah, but you're screwing yourself. Let's be clear. If you believe that this process happens by magic, then you're screwing yourself.
Magic might be the wrong word, but you get what I'm saying. That type of philosophy.
But a lot of, I mean,
that it comes from somewhere else. That it's not, and you're right, because it's the same argument about when religious people say, oh, I knew this kid who born again Christian was a drug addict, and he says it was Christianity and him finding Jesus that got him through it. I'm like, you are taking credit away from your strength because you're giving all your credit to somebody else. And I feel like it's the same thing you're saying. You're giving credit to some supernatural thing or something else when really it's your doing because you're gathering all that information. I mean, everybody's influenced by everything, influenced by your environment. So this idea, like, I would believe that philosophy if somebody who's never listened to music one day wrote the best song ever, but that doesn't happen. It's somebody who's obsessed with music and listens to a lot of music, and all of a sudden he writes the best thing ever, you know? So,
and you're screwing yourself because you are making it a process you can't control and reliably do, right? So this is the long history of human progress, is that things move from being sort of magical, like, I don't know, just happens. People die of diseases that don't know why it happens. Or, I don't know how babies happen. I just know my wife's pregnant. Isn't that awesome? Right? And the point is that if you want to go about your life that way, you're welcome to do it. But, you're going to be celebrating pregnancies when you should actually be pissed that your wife is sleeping around, and you're not going to be able to reliably do the thing. So whether people have read it or not, whether they know about it or not, creativity has been extensively studied. There's huge amounts of science on how innovation happens. And we now know, if you want one book, Where Good Ideas Come From by Stephen Johnson, which is an amazing book. And a lot of what you're saying, without even having read the book, is what's in the book, right? So ideas come together, they have idea sex, and new combinations are generated. Also, they build on each other, so there's what's called the adjacent possible. So there's what becomes possible when the prerequisite technologies come around. So why, for example, did Beethoven or Mozart never write a rock song? Well, there were no electric guitars back then.
Yeah.
They hadn't really figured out electricity, so it's hardly a surprise that they never created that sound. Those raw materials just weren't around for them. And so now we live in a time when there are more raw materials and we can do things. But guess what? There are things that haven't been pieced together yet that we can't yet get to because we just haven't put together the building blocks. And Joe Henrich, who wrote this great book, The Secret of Our Success, about cultural evolution, says, that Newton has this famous line, if I have seen further, it is because I have stood on the shoulders of giants.
Yeah.
So Newton, And Henrich was like, well, you really look at this stuff, you really study it, and you realize there are no giants. It's hobbits all the way down. And so it's everybody incrementally making their contributions, and we all stand on those to see further. So what this now means is that you now have a playbook for how to intentionally innovate, where you want to go out and you want to draw together as much information as possible, as many influences as possible, keep piecing them together and recombining them, and then guess what? Just like me trying to invent a new dish, much of it's going to be a dud, right? And many things will start out as duds, and then you'll have to keep on tweaking them until they're good.
Well, sometimes we believe that, okay, this is a new idea, and this idea came from the blue, it came from nowhere, but it's bullshit. Like,
of course it's bullshit.
Like, you're influenced by something, and that's just like you said, you didn't go from Beethoven and a piano to heavy metal, and you had blues and jazz, and those things influenced rock, which turned into metal eventually. So it was like these small steps. It wasn't like just all of a sudden I decide I'm going to create this instrument that sounds just like distortion and crunchy, and I'm going to write these songs that are fast and have double bass and and crash cymbals. So it is and
like, heavy metal is also reacting against earlier musical movements. So part of it is this building up, and then part of it is that periodically people are like, that shit is bullshit, and then they swing so far the other way, and then people see that and they're like, that shit is bullshit, and then they react and swing so far the other way. And so this is those sorts of social dynamics.
The punk movement was huge. I mean, it was very I mean, they weren't even very good musicians, a lot of them. They were just really passionate, and that's what people liked about it. And it was the fact that they're angry. It was, you know, against the government, against, you know, authority, against, you know, it's funny, I have a police officer buddy of mine, and we're talking about how like with my kids, how I'm like, I let my son do whatever the fuck he wants, as long as he's not hurting himself or somebody else. And I'm like, I try to have, you know, as little rules as possible, you know, and I'm like, let him explore, let him, you know, because a lot of times my perspective is I think he keeps knocking this over because he's being a dick, but what he's really doing is he's turned it into a game, and it's fun for him. And from my perspective, I think like this little asshole, but really what's going on is just from his perspective, he's just having fun. He finds it funny that daddy has to get up every time, and
that's right.
You know, so
he's playing you
exactly, you know, and playing is okay. And you know, as adults, we kind of forget that. And when you're a child, everything's a game, and everything's just, you know, you're looking for something to entertain yourself with,
right.
And you're finding silly things to you know, to have fun with. And so what the fuck was I talking about?
Well, but that spirit of play is also a crucial component of innovation, right? It's the willingness to play, right? And what you find again and again, that's what science is supposed to be about. Science is supposed to be experimental, right? Like, we're fucking around. We're like, what happens if we do this? What happens if we do that? You know, I think that this would happen if we did this. Let's find out. Let's test that hypothesis.
And the thing about science too is that it's become a dogma where you know, I've heard you say it, and I don't think it was your quote, but maybe it could be. Nothing has dug more graves than science, you know, and it's so true. I mean, it's crazy how people will take like, okay, what we know now is it is the gold standard. It's like we figured it all out. We're good now, you know. And it's like, you know, you've talked about, you know, germ theory, and I think it was you. I've listened to so many podcasts, but I know you also have talked about it, where, you know, the whole idea of like washing your hands seemed fucking crazy at one time because you couldn't see it and you couldn't understand it, and to think that like, oh no, we've discovered, like I had Cara Santa Maria on my show, and I don't know if you know who she is. She does a podcast called Talk Nerdy. She's been on the Rogan podcast. She used to do a lot of work on the Young Turks. But I remember she's very like, I think her family was, I don't know if they're Mormons or something like that, but it seems like there's a common trend with people who come from really spiritual, religious families and then go to the other extreme. We're like, well, fuck this. These people are crazy. Like, if I can't prove it, it doesn't exist, you know? And you know, I remember at like the end of our conversation when I had her on, I asked her, I'm like, hey, do you think, you know, there's going to be any real sign? Because I kind of had a feeling that what she was going to say, but I kind of wanted to just kind of ask her and kind of see if how open-minded she was. So I'm like, you know, I'm like, hey, do you think we've discovered like basically like this is it, or in 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now, we're going to look back the same way we looked at our, you know, primitive ancestors and say those guys were fucking idiots. Like, they didn't have anything figured out. No, we have most of it figured out. No, I don't think there's going to be any real great breakthroughs. I'm like, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm like, don't you think every scientist in every generation has said the same thing?
Everybody thinks they've reached the top of the pyramid of hobbits. They always do, and that's, you know, it's, you know, before we started recording this. Who knows if this gets released into the world? But before we started recording, you were dancing around essentially, you know, the fact that what you appreciate about the podcasting world is that it's a group of seekers, right?
It is.
It's curious seekers, and the point is that that's also what science is supposed to be about, and that's where science started. But now science has become a rigid, mature, 800-pound gorilla of a bureaucracy. It's no longer a startup. And so the result is that, you know, it's now about, it's like Hewlett-Packard, it's like the Catholic Church, it's like any institution where it's like, it's about power and privilege and prestige and working your way up through the ranks by like blah, blah, blah,
You're
blah.
so right.
And that's not what it's supposed to be about. And I think that, you know, well, firstly, I can guarantee you, right, that I could sit here with, you know, Cara Santa Maria and tell her bunches of pieces of science that exist, that have been published, that have been peer-reviewed, that have been well-tested, that she has never heard of. Because science is so bad at communicating within itself and with the general public. So I bet if we had a conversation about, you know, Joe Henrich and the secret of our success and all of that research, she probably doesn't know about it. Because if she did, it would ultimately, utterly change your view of the world. There's I guarantee you that we could play that game with her, and if you want, I could give you a list of things and you could get her back on the show and we can just see, like, okay, you didn't know about this, you didn't know about this, you didn't know about this. So that's the first thing. The other thing is that I think that we're in the middle of a tremendous intellectual revolution. Because in the 1950s, all of this, Marshall McLuhan, who came up with the idea of the global village, and he has this famous line, the medium is the message, right? And so baked into every technology is a message. And the message that's baked into broadcast journalism, of you have 3 TV stations and there are newscasters, is that we are the important people, we are the authorities, and we're going to tell you what to think. And so that's how the world operated, right? You had these guys, you had these trusted white scientists in lab coats, and they went on there and they told you what to think.
They told you cigarettes were healthy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The problem is that unchecked authority, like all unchecked authority, is always abused. Always. They told you cigarettes were healthy. You had people, trusted senators like Joseph McCarthy, who abused their power. And the point is that now what's happened is that now there's a new medium, the internet and podcasting and all of this. And what it does is it changes. It has a new message. And the new message is that everybody gets a voice. And that people can challenge and question authority in ways they couldn't do in the 1950s. And some of that is going to be unwise challenging of authority, but ultimately what's going to happen is that you're going to break down the idea that any human is authority, and the only authority will be the evidence. It's like, great, you say this, that's a great opinion. Opinions are like assholes, everybody has one, right?
Yeah.
What is your opinion based on? And then we're all going to have to get to the stage where we're then checking each other's conclusions and really looking at what we know. And essentially the ivory tower, the walls around it, will break down, and we'll all have to approach the world through the core principle of science, which is that we should let reality be our guide.
But and that would be a never-ending journey, because things
That's
are
exactly
constantly...
right. Yep.
It's like, okay, this evidence says this, but now I have this other evidence. And that's almost that issue with the internet, where when the internet first became just basically everybody had it and everybody had access to it, it became one of those things that it would actually shut down what would be in the past long debates, because it'd be like, you know what, I'll just look this thing up. You're saying this and I'm saying that, let's look it up. But now it's gotten to the point where just like so much shit on the internet that literally I could look up something that says that it has proof that Trump is a reptilian,
That's
and
right.
so it's like I could literally find anything to back any opinion I have. So it's almost like too much information.
So what comes next?
That's a good question.
Well, think about it. So there's this problem of noise, not knowing what you can trust, and it's a problem that we all share.
Well, everybody has a voice now, so it's like, but before it was, there is something about, I feel like when the internet was first coming about, it was probably a lot of people who were passionate about certain things or felt strong, but now literally it's become so easy that anybody can say anything at any time, and disinformation or misinformation is just as strong as actual good information. And even if you just plant this, what's that book, Merchants of Doubt, similar thing. And the guy who did Gasland, Gasland is another great documentary, but Gasland, he did another documentary about this whole idea of even if you don't actually, if you just plant the seed of doubt, even if you just ask the question, like, well, is that science really accurate, or blah, it's like, then just plant the seed of doubt and people are going to question even good information. And I forget what his other documentary was. He did one, a newer one, I believe it was for HBO, and it had a long title, and it was, I believe it was about this, and it was just...
Clearly you should have had a better title, because if you can't remember the title...
Yeah, I can't remember the title. And
You're trying to promote the guy's work,
what's his name? Fox? The guy who did, the fracking movie Gasland?
Oh, yeah, no, I haven't seen that.
He's been on on Chris's podcast. I like Chris's podcast. He's it's funny, because when you were on my podcast the first time, I referenced him quite a bit, and it was one of those things where he's one of those people that, like yourself, kind of break through, because he has a resume to be respected by intellectual people, but yet he's also will dibble dabble and you know, he's friends with some people that they would call that pseudoscience, or this guy's you know, crazy, or you know, looking at things outside the box, and you know, that's why once you guys hooked up, I'm like, oh, that's awesome, because I knew you guys would have a good conversation, and even I remember when I had him on, like there's certain guests that I have like him, Dan Carlin. There's certain guests that actually make me nervous when I have them on, just because I'm like, oh, I want these people to like me, because I like them, and you know, and they've been huge influences, and you know, of course, coincidentally, those are always the shows I feel like I did the worst on, because I can't do this like in person. And that's the thing, you lose. You know, I know that you met him in person, and you know, when you're on the Rogan podcast, you're there in person. I think a lot, and I know you try to do that a lot too, is just be in person. I think there's something you lose through Skype. It's just you know, we're talking about before, I don't know if we're recording or not, just how important just being around people, and how we're social creatures, and no matter how good the audio and visual is, just not actually being there in person, there's definitely something you lose with you can get in a comfort zone in person that you can't get, you know, like my co-host who I started the podcast with. When we first started the show, we'd do a lot of just bullshitting, me and him. We would just talk, and he's big into Buddhism and just really like interesting thinker, and we would have like really fun conversations. So I'm like, you know, let's start here and just see where it goes. And when I would have guests on, I would try to capture those casual conversations, right? And it would be with certain guests, it'd be a little harder than others. And it's like, you know, at first I'm like, is it the guest? Is it me? And I'm like, it's fucking Skype. You know, it's because I'm not in person. You know, and there's something you lose. And no matter how good technology gets, you just can't recreate, you know, just the actual live conversation and being together. And I remember when I had CJ Werleman on, he was talking about how you know, he's from Australia. I don't know if you know CJ Werleman. Yeah. He's written a bunch of he's much like yourself, not a big fan of Sam Harris, and he's had, you know, and I'll tell you, man, I give him a lot of props, because he's an atheist who basically bashed the king of all atheists, you know, and which isn't great for his brand and his, you know, his market. But you know what, I give him a lot of props, because he knows his history. He knows, you know, he understands that it's, you know, like I remember when I told you about the Dan Carlin, Sam Harris argument debate.
Yeah, which was great. That was super helpful.
Yeah, it is, because it was funny, because it was one of those podcasts. I'm like, why didn't this podcast go viral? Right. Because I think a little bit had to do with because Dan Carlin's so polite. Some people didn't even see it as a debate, and I'm like, what you're not picking up on is this is a debate, and Dan Carlin's very polite, so he doesn't get upset, or he doesn't ever seem like. So sometimes we're just sharing ideas, which is exactly how you probably should have a debate.
No, but I think this is something that I've been thinking about a lot. Is, you know, because this comes down to like cultural norms, right? And you know, you talked about before the podcast, or before whatever this thing is, you know, you talked about like healthy debate, right?
How important that
is.
And
I think the real question is, what is healthy debate, right? And the problem is that, you know, a lot of people confuse healthy debate for politeness. And I'm going to be really nice and respectful and not challenge you and all of that.
You're absolutely right.
And you know, because the Sam Harris Dan Carlin one, and the Sam Harris Jonathan Haidt one, and to a large degree the Sam Harris Jordan Peterson ones.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. Well, I know where you're going with this, because one thing that kind of bothered me about that conversation with Dan Carlin was that every time Sam Harris would make a point, Dan Carlin would acknowledge it. Every time Dan Carlin would make a point, Sam Harris would just try to, you know, deflect that point somewhere else and say, well, but, you know, but actually, or go on to something else. He was just so obsessed with winning the argument, or at least, maybe not, I don't know if it's winning.
No,
or
he's winning. Not. He's listen, let's just...
Or defending his point. He wanted to make sure that it's like, listen, I think I'm in the right, and no matter what you say, I'll just keep... I am so... It's almost... And this is the thing with atheism, is that, like, my brother, for example, like, he, you know, he's an atheist. I think I probably, when I was younger, I really got into atheism, I think, before he did. But it was crazy, because now he went to... Him and a lot of other people that I know have gone to that side so far that I'm like, I don't even like to call myself an atheist anymore, because at first I thought, you know, when I was in high school and I was raised, I had First Communion, I did all this stuff. Atheism was where I went to. It's like, oh, these motherfuckers have like they ask questions.
Yeah.
They're like, no, that shit doesn't make sense. And I'm not just going to
Yep.
accept it. I'm like, I like that. I'm like, it's curiosity.
That's right.
But then it got to the point where just like, no. Now you just picked a team, and
That's
everybody
exactly right.
You know, and everybody has to be a part of the team. And it's like my brother, I will see like, you know, and similar atheists will talk about how all religion, you know, it's like Sam Harris, all religion is bad and life would be. I'm like, well, how do you argue the people who use it as a moral compass? Like, for example, the guy I was talking about, I don't remember, and this is going to be a recurring theme of what was recorded and not recorded, but
Right.
I don't know if it was prior to recording or not, but the kid I was talking about who was a born-again Christian, a drug addict, used finding Christ as his strength to get his life together. And so in a way, we talked about how he takes away some of the props that he should get, and some of the he should get some of the credit for overcoming this. But if believing in this spiritual thing helped him get through it, then who the fuck am I to say it was a bad thing? You know,
Right.
And in his life, it was a good thing. Even if I don't believe that there was this super, you know, human person that was looking down on him and giving him the strength, and if it was internal strength, but who am I to tell him that it wasn't beneficial in his life and his circumstances?
But it's a story. Like, that's the point. It was a story that worked for him. And really, what are the things, you know, it was a story that worked for him with a few core principles that he could live by, and then also he got a sense of community. Now, the point is that, you know, the symbol there was the cross and, you know, Jesus and all that sort of stuff, and a fish and whatever. He could have gotten the same thing potentially from Marvel comic books, right? You
Which
know,
I love.
Yeah, exactly.
Actually, it was funny because you used to bring that up, because I remember even finding, you know, like growing up and being a big X-Men nerd.
Yeah.
And I'm always like, this is kind of like telling the story of like minorities. I'm like these people are the minority, they're different.
Yep.
So the majority dislikes them not because they understand them and they understand why they dislike them. They just dislike them because they're different. And I'm like, that's a lot of what society does today. Anything that's different, it's
That's
like,
right.
you know, it's you know, I always talk about how
And also, not only are they different, they're better, right? Like, they're in the, if you're
are you
talking,
saying minorities are better?
but I think no, but I mean, I think, you know, so Thaddeus Russell, it was in I think Thaddeus Russell talked about this on the Rogan podcast, maybe, or but it's also, I think, in pretty much in Renegade History, and he just talked about white jealousy of black culture, right? Like, their music is better, you know, they dance better, like, there's a freedom and an inclusivity.
And isn't that weird? Because it's funny because Thaddeus, you know, I'm a big fan of Thaddeus. He's another guy who I had on my podcast that I've been a fan of for a long time and probably sucked because of it. But you know, it is funny because, you know, it's something I've thought a lot about growing up. How many friends I had that were slightly racist but loved black culture. Like, they listen to hip hop. They listen, you know, even kids in high school. I remember when I was growing up and gangster rap was popular, and they loved, you know, Tupac and Biggie or whatever. But yet, and then they would say something racist like that weekend or something like that. Like, and I'm just like, wait. So you love the culture, you love the music, you love the dancing, you even love the girls.
That's
right.
right.
But you don't like them, like you,
Yeah,
and it's just like I wonder what causes that. If it's either just
think about it. So let's break this down, right? So, you know, I mean, this is what people do in general, right? So, okay, so you're like, objectively, right? You're just focused on the music. The music is fucking awesome, right? The culture is fun, right? The girls are hot, and, like, you know, there's an attractive. Plus, there's a slight forbidden fruit thing going on, which everybody loves. Like, oh my God, I'm, you know, flirting with the people that I shouldn't be flirting with, right? I mean, that's always an appeal. But then, you know, really, what is, like, I had a conversation yesterday with somebody, Jenkins B. Jennings, about racism. And, like, you know, I have uncles who say racist shit. And I'm like, honestly, like, I don't think it's about some belief about black people or anything like that. So much of why they're saying that is because they're trying to be provocative, and they're trying to, like, get a rise out of people and all of that, and, like, it's a form of sort of social signaling of, like, you know, whatever.
But I also think it has something to do with what you talk a lot about, is the fact that, like, where do your ideas and beliefs come from? I think it's not a surprise that racist parents end up having racist kids.
Yeah, of course.
I mean, how many kids grow up in, you know, with parents that are skinheads and they become skinheads? You think it's coincidental that they're like, oh no, I just think these ideas made sense, and I no, it's like, or you're a Republican because your dad was a Republican.
That's right.
You know,
or talk, you know, I mean, like, this is the thing that I've been thinking about a lot: evolution, right? So, you know, there's a statistic, whatever the statistic you want to use, 50% of Americans don't believe in evolution, 50% of Americans do, right? And when you spend time around scientists, that statistic is then interpreted, and it's 50% of Americans are idiots, right? And in fact, you know, having spent time at a school that taught creationism and having actually like talked to people who believe in evolution but who have no freaking clue how what the thing is or how it works, I think what the statistic really means is that 99% of humans toe the line with whatever the people around them believe, and they care more about fitting in than any sort of principle. So if fitting in a group of guys is about we're all saying racist shit, then that's what they do. If you flip the dynamic in the group where it's like, why are you saying racist shit, dude? That's not cool. Or, dude, you just said this racist shit, but you like all this black music. What a fucking idiot you are, right? So it's what is the social dynamic, and what gives us a sense of belonging and community and status, which are the things
really
that really what everybody cares about.
They talk about how, you know, I think one of the things that brings people together the most is singing together. You know, when you look at churches, you look at concerts, why is there this bond when you're there? You know, it's that singing together. It kind of brings everybody together. And
now you're talking about what God really is, by the way.
And what's that?
So there's, in John Haidt's happiness hypothesis, there's this whole section on, you know, so Haidt studied disgust. That's where his work began, right? And you know, he has a famous line that he got disgusted with disgust. Like at a certain point, he just couldn't think about disgust anymore. You know, disgust serves an evolutionary function, right? It keeps you away from things that are potentially disease-causing, right? You're disgusted by rotten meat or fish or, you know, feces or whatever it may be. And in fact, women have a stronger disgust reflex. Because they're more vulnerable to things, and their disgust reflex goes through the roof after they've just had a child, right? Because they're particularly vulnerable. So, you know, this disgust is very useful. But what Haidt started thinking about is that in general, emotions often sort of come in these pairs, right? You have happiness and you have sadness, right? You have, you know, anger, and, you know, you have whatever the opposite of anger is. But so they tend to come in these pairs, and he sort of started to think, you know, okay, so what's the opposite of disgust, right? And he realized that the opposite of disgust is this emotion that we generally don't talk about called transcendence, which is that experience of being lifted out of yourself and part of something larger. And there are certain experiences that are very good at triggering this.
Astronauts.
Yeah, they have that experience.
Yeah.
They're out there, and suddenly they see themselves, and they come back down, and they try and describe the experience. Dance is very good at that. Marching in a military unit, right? What happens is it bonds you into this single unit. Dance and song, right, binds you into a single unit. And, you know, that's a lot of what religion is about. A lot of going to church is you go, you sing, there's a rhythm
and
to
nationalism. I mean,
nationalism,
nationalism, very similar. I mean, the military spends tons of money on doing all these patriotic things at you know, sports events and stuff like that, and that's taxpayer money that's paying for those jets that are flying over,
of course,
that make us all feel like we're proud and we're doing the national anthem together and all this stuff, and it seems like brainwashing to me.
Of course, but that's exactly the point of it. The exact point of this emotion of transcendence is that you stop being, so Haidt took this idea from Emil Durkheim, right? But so that he talks about homo duplex. There's profane, everyday man who lives down on the ground and is doing his thing. And then there's this elevated man that is lifted out and part of something larger, right? It's essentially, that's when you get to the real hive mind. When you move from being like a single bee doing your thing, and suddenly you're this swarm of bees. And that swarm of bees is an army, or, you know, a group of fans, or whatever it is, and you're all in unison. And people love that experience. It's one of the most satisfying experiences. It's why they go to raves, why they go to concerts, why they cheer for the home sports team, and that's a lot of what sort of hold large-scale societies together. And the other thing you can do to achieve transcendence is drugs.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that a lot of people who are, you know, it's like that argument. I had like Dennis McKenna on my podcast, Terrence's brother.
And the other McKenna.
The other McKenna. Well, he's actually, I'll tell you, he's I think equally as interesting, because he's he looks into the medical benefits of it and all that stuff, and has a science background to really understand it from it. He was in a great documentary too when called Neurons to Nirvana, which is really good and just really interesting guy. He's been on the Rogan podcast a bunch of times, and but a lot of people believe that in the 60s, when all this whole anti-war movement, a lot of this anti-war movement came from the fact that all these people were getting fucked up on LSD and mushrooms and stuff like that, and because of it, it was much harder to convince them to go kill people they didn't know for reasons they weren't sure of, and that was a big part of it. And then you get people, the conspiratorial side, that says they think the government pushed it on to the public because it made us less likely to be aggressive, or less likely to be anti-government, and make us dumber, so we're easier to brainwash. But that theory doesn't make as much sense to me. But yeah, I mean, I think there's a big part of it. I think it's not I've had a lot of musicians on my show. I've had a lot of comedians on my show, and a lot of artists that really look at things outside the box. It's not a coincidence that I think a lot of them have done some type of DMT or acid or mushrooms, or you look at the Bill Hicks, the George Carlins, the stuff like that, and then it just seems like there's something about, and probably just like we talked about with traveling, anytime we're creatures of habit. When we see the same things constantly and we do the same things constantly, we're thinking the same way too. Yep. So if we can just kind of get out of that routine, sometimes it helps you kind of look at things from different perspectives. And I think doing some psychedelics will do that. I've thought about even dibble-dabbling with it just as an adult, just because I would want to just kind of explore my own thoughts and ideas and see if I could get some beneficial aspects to it. But I don't think it's a coincidence. I don't think it's a coincidence. It's a lot of deep thinkers and people that seem more interesting and less easily brainwashed are people who have done, smoked weed or done DMT or mushrooms or psychedelics and stuff like that.
But I think I have very limited drug experience.
So would you contribute your ability to kind of see things outside the box?
I think that's the thing. I think it's for me, it's mostly culture shifting, right? If you're constantly...
You were born in Saudi Arabia, right?
Born in Saudi Arabia, moved to New York, moved to Brazil, moved to... Oh my God, it's Marie O'Reilly. How are you doing, Marie? You should know that we're recording. So, no. I just mean so that you're walking into... Your voice will be recorded for posterity.
We can...
Put it all up before it then.
Good to see you.
How are you?
Glad to have you back.
Thanks.
Hey, Ricky, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
I've been trying to get Marie on a podcast, but she just had a baby,
funny?
so...
Oh, really? Because
Yeah,
I was going to say, one thing that's funny is that when you do a podcast, like, sometimes it's easier to get, like, popular guests than your friends. Like, than people do you find that experience? Because people are like, what am I going to talk about? And I'm like, I find you interesting. That means you're, it's like, then come on. And it just, there's something about, like, there's a lot of people who don't realize they're interesting,
Well, that is Marie in a nutshell. Marie is brilliant and very interesting, and I've been trying to get her on the podcast, but I actually think this is all just a negotiation tactic. I think she's just raising her value, and at a certain point I'm going to get a list of demands and a fee and all of that, and then she'll be like...
First of all, you just had a baby?
Yeah.
Like 6 months ago?
5 weeks ago, yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Wow.
But that's what I'm saying, Marie.
Great rebound, yeah.
Thanks.
What did you have?
A girl. She's inside.
Oh, awesome. Congratulations.
Thanks, yeah.
And is it first?
Yep.
Oh, dude, it's so much fun. I have a 10-month-old girl, and I have a 2-year-old boy.
Oh, wow.
And it's so much fun.
Oh, cool.
The first couple months are definitely the hardest because it's just like the lack of sleep. Sleep's a thing of the past, and sleep. I mean, they're just constant. You know what it is? It's almost like you feel like you give so much, and you don't get a whole lot of feedback back.
Right.
Quite yet, but like once you hit like 6 months, 8 months, 10 months, it's like once her personality starts coming out, it's the most rewarding thing ever. It's so much fun, and
that's so great.
Oh my God, it's like it's one of the. I feel like being a parent is you don't have any kids that you you pay child support, but you're not in their lives, and but if I feel like parenting's similar to like war. Like a veteran could be sitting here and telling us about his experience, and he could be amazing with describing it and stuff, but we just couldn't quite understand it the same as going through it. And I feel like parenting is very similar, where I had so many people tell me about it before I had kids, like, it's going to change your life. I'm like, I've heard this before, blah, 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 you know, and then once you go through, like, holy shit, like, you can never love anything as much as you love your children. Like, I've always been very good with, you know, it's like just kind of being very down to earth, and I'm like, okay, understanding the situations, and be very, like, in stressful situations, not always thinking the worst, and like, once I have kids, it's like the things that go through my head, I'm like, what if this happens? What if that happens? You know, it's like, what the fuck is wrong with me? Like, calm down, like, nothing bad's gonna happen, you know. But you just love something so much that you're afraid of something going wrong, or, you know, losing it or whatever. And then when you hear stories about, like, people who've lost their kids, it's like, it hits home in a way that it's like, you know, now it just, I'm like, I'm not even sure I could survive something like that, you know, just like losing a child, you know, at 2 or whatever,
see,
you know, whatever age.
I mean, the point is, that's great evolutionary psych. The point is that you're designed to be extra paranoid as a parent.
Yeah,
so that you troubleshoot all the problems before they occur. So, you know, I think that's also part of what's helpful, is just to recognize that, like, that paranoia is what's right with you. You're supposed to be paranoid in this situation. And the point is that once you then have that paranoid thought, you can then design around it to, you know, limit your chances of something bad happening.
Yeah, that does make sense. The other thing that's really amazing about having kids is, I forget who said this. I'd love to give her credit, but she was talking about how when you fall in love and you get married or whatever, or you're in a long-term relationship, how you feel like, okay, I've done it. Like, this is my life partner, and I've fallen in love, and that fun part of, like, exploring somebody and them exploring you and getting to know them, and that excitement of seeing each other, that in time kind of fades a little bit, and you kind of feel like, okay, I'm never gonna have this experience again. You know, like, I'm married, and I'm like, I'm like, when me and my wife first met, it was the fun of drinking and laughing, and I cared about her story, she cared about mine, and now nobody cares about what we have to say, because I've heard all of her stories, she's heard all my stories, you know. But, like, so it's like, you're like, oh, I'm never gonna have that experience of, like, falling in love again. And then you have kids, and you're like, you actually get to go through it again. It's like another opportunity of, like, falling in love again, and you fall in love with this little, you know, this little creation, and it's amazing.
Do you feel that it's also revitalized your marriage, or?
I think it can't. You know, it's funny. I have a buddy who I was just in Connecticut not too long ago, and we came to see him and his wife, and they just had their first child. And I told him, I'm like, at times it's gonna bring you guys together in ways that nothing else could, and at times it's gonna break you guys apart in ways, because you're so stressed at times. And, like, one thing, like, I always tell my wife, I'm like, you know, I'm like, listen, we're gonna butt heads at times, but we have to understand, no matter what we're butting heads about, like, that we're butting heads for the same reason, because we both love this thing, and we both want what's best for this thing, and we might have different opinions how to go about it. So sometimes we'll be so concerned about, like, oh, you don't agree with me or whatever, but we're losing the fact that, like, it's because our hearts are in the right place and we both love this thing. So it's like, as long as we both want what's right, you'll resolve it, you know. But
and by resolving it, you'll come up with a better solution than either of you would have come up with on your own.
Yeah.
Because it's you know,
and it's give and take sometimes too. Like, there's certain things that, you know, I might have researched that she didn't, that I'm like, listen, you take my word for it, like, I think this is the best way of handling this,
right.
and vice versa, you know. And so I think it's also a little bit of trust too, you know. It's a little bit of trust, a little bit, but it's a journey. And you know, I think the first year is really hard, because you're trying to deal with stressful situations and dealing with somebody that you live with or whatnot, and your lack of sleep, your lack of food, your lack of, you know, just being able to be calm and collective, and you know, you're very easily agitated, and so it just, you know, that makes it hard, because it's just like, okay, I live with my wife, we see each other all the time, which just alone with no kids can sometimes, you can be at each other's throats, and now you add a child that's making sure you're not sleeping right, and I mean, I can't remember the last time I had more than 3-4 hours of sleep in a row, you know, without being disturbed. So I think it just all those factors. But at other times when your kids are you know, we brought them to Hampton Beach for the 4th of July. It was like our first, like, real family vacation, and to see their enjoyment, I mean, of course brings me and the wife together, because we just we're like, the experience for us, it's like, okay, we've been to beaches before, but, like, to see them enjoy it, it just makes everything that you've already done fun again. And it's an amazing experience. Hunter's gonna have to, you know, start calling some of his
acknowledge some of my children. It's terrible. But wait, you're saying that because I thought it was just to spread one's genetic material far and wide
Wait, you're supposed
and
to
incur
love that thing?
financial obligations. But apparently you're saying that it's the emotional parts of it that really
Yeah,
make it
it's-
worthwhile?
Yeah, it is.
Jesus! I
Wow.
wish somebody had told me this before, but
Well, there's a kid here that you can dote on.
that's right. I'm excited to, I'll start with uncling, and then I'll
Nice,
work my
nice.
way into acknowledging my own children, rather than just Genghis Khanning the world. Genghis got to 1%. If I could get to like 2%,
What is it? They say 1% of Asia still has his DNA.
No, I think
like
it's
that?
1% of humanity or something.
Really?
Oh yeah, it's pretty. You might be a descendant of Genghis Khan.
That's what I said.
We all might.
Okay, I better go do some mothering.
Okay, Marie, good to see you, and I'll see you soon. Yeah, and you look amazing for having just given birth to a child. So yeah, I don't know what the Genghis Khan statistic is, but it's
Yeah, it's a
disturbingly
lot.
high.
Yeah, it is. And then that to go back to ideologies, I mean, that's another one who, he convinced many people to, based on ideology. There's no need for religion, and you can
That's
get
right.
people to think
You
a certain
can
way.
unite the clans around anything.
Yeah, yeah, and that's
And
what
that-
Dan Carlin was the point that he was making. He talked about the Spartans. He talked about
Yeah.
nationalism and the military. I mean, how do you get all these people to kill for a cause?
Of course.
And so this idea that it's religion.
No,
that-
it's
you can insert, like he said, you can take out religion and insert many different ideologies.
It's
and
culture,
different,
right? Culture binds and blinds, and you get people to bind and blind around ideas. So the point is that here's the real deal with Sammy Boy Harris, right? Is that what Sam is really defending is his ego, because his ego is wrapped up in there's this how do you think of yourself, right, and your own intelligence, right? And I get this because I grew up in this culture. I grew up in a culture environment that's very similar to Sam, where it's like so important to be smart. Smart is the most important thing. You really want to be smart. You're a kid. You don't know how smart works, but you're like, do I have this thing? And you're like, I want to go to the fancy school because then I'll know I'm smart, right? I want to do this. I want to get the good grades. I want to have read all the books and to talk knowledgeably and try and impress people. And the point is that for a long time I tried to do that, and it's horrible and it's exhausting because you're constantly, what you're doing is you're defending your ideas, but what you're really defending is your ego. And you've conflated the two together. You've mixed them up. And then, partly because of reading all of this science and partly because of tutoring all these kids, I learned to separate the two out. Because I understand that, my ability to learn is fine. Everybody's ability to learn is fine, right? The humans have, and in fact, I was looking for intelligence.
Well, that's what your book is about.
That's right.
Yeah.
And I was looking for intelligence in all the wrong places. I thought that it was all about, the ability to do the skill of math or the skill of music or the skill of reading or the skill of writing. It has nothing to do with that, right? Humans have social intelligence, like you're talking about your kids. They can learn whatever thing from all the people around them, and you just have to give them exposure to the right influences.
And they even have social skills at when they're little, before they can communicate, that they actually lose in time, because initially all they have to communicate is seeing, like, social cues, seeing your facial expressions, your tone, and all that stuff. And they say as you get older, as you become a child and you learn how to communicate with language, you kind of don't emphasize those skills anymore, and then you kind of lose them a little bit.
That's right.
But what was that experiment? I'm sure.
But so talk about, you talked about, for example, you as a kid picking up your mother's anxiety, right, and your mother's fears, right, and so people pick those things
and you
up.
ever hear about the study with what was it, in Germany? There was an epidemic of colicky babies.
Yeah.
And then come to find out, it was mostly or all Jewish families that were going with this issue, and it was right before World War II, and they contributed to the anxiety that they were having with not knowing what was going to happen with the war and what was going to happen, and their kids felt that and sensed that. And,
of course, because the humanity's superpower is our social intelligence, right? So there's this image that I am doing everything I can to popularize. It's some of the science that Marie Santacana, or whatever her name is, Santa Maria Braxis, whatever her name is. It sounds like.
Well, she did date Bill Maher for a little bit, which is another guy who goes over the deep end with his atheism and stuff like that.
Let's be clear. All these people, it's not about atheism, right? Atheism is just like, do you believe or not believe in God? And like any ecosystem of belief, right? There's people all over the spectrum. There are atheists. There are, anti-theists, who I've talked to some of them, who are really like, they're just extremists, right? They're radicalized. And that's...
well, the fact that there's like atheist gatherings, meets, podcasts...
It's a religion.
I'm like, what the fuck do you... Like, how do you do an atheist podcast? How often can you talk about how... like, you literally are doing a you're having constant conversation about people you disagree with, and you're just batting down all their arguments. Okay, we understand. You disagree with them. A lot of what their beliefs are based on is faith. It doesn't make scientific sense, and that should be the end of it. Like, the fact that like you feel like it's this fight that has to continue over and over again because you have to eliminate religion from the face of the earth. It's so silly because
but that's it has all the elements that religion provides people with. Jesus is the answer. Atheism is the answer. Islam is the answer. There's always there's no shortage. Communism is the answer. There's no shortage of these belief systems. They're all grounded in the idea that if only we can get people to stop believing in God, or if only we can get them to believe in Allah.
But I can see why they initially, like the same reason why I initially was intrigued with it, because it seemed like it was the path to exploring different ideas, and this is where curious people come, because they're not just taking somebody's word for it, they're asking questions. And then, like you said, eventually it does become very cultish, and it is crazy. But a lot of things are like that. I remember, Stefan Molyneux.
Stefan Molyneux.
Yeah. I remember first time he was on the Rogan podcast, and they were talking about Peter Joseph, and he had a debate with Peter Joseph, Stefan, and at the end of the podcast, it was I think it was close to the end of the podcast. And him and Pete and Stefan are talking about how it's funny how certain things stick with you, like such a little thing, and of all the things I've ever read or listened to, why this stuck with me. But I remember him talking about how Peter Joseph is kind of cultish, the whole Zeitgeist movement, this and that. And I'm thinking, wait, Stefan's saying this?
Yeah.
And Rogan's agreeing with him? I'm like, Stefan is the leader of a cult, his cult, and it's funny because eventually, right? They're saying this, and I'm like, Rogan. I'm like, either Rogan is blind to, Stefan's work or something. But eventually, his last appearance on the Rogan podcast, Rogan calls him out on a bunch of shit and says, "You're telling people to stop talking to their friends if they don't believe like this, or think like this. You're telling people, this and that." And Stefan's, of course, fumbling his words and has no real explanation to this, and he's all about capitalism, but yet I remember there was some dispute about people sharing his videos, or no, he was talking about the free market or something like that, and similar thing, when you look at Stefan having debates, his debates aren't a sharing of ideas. It's not like, okay, I disagree with you, but I'm going to share my ideas, you're going to share yours, and we'll see where this conversation goes. It was about, like you said, it was this, it's about being right. And that's why, like, when I was growing up, like, I used to find it intriguing. I remember when YouTube first became popular, and you have to wait 6 hours for something to load. But I couldn't wait to see the debate between the religious person and anti-religious person, because I'm like, I'm just really interested to see what, when this person says this, what is he going to say? And and just kind of, I enjoyed the picking at each other's minds. But it didn't take long before I got to the point where I'm like, this isn't like rewarding at all. Like, this person is always going to say he's right and going to disregard any point the other person says, and the other person's going to do the same thing. And it's just like they already picked a team, they just defend that team till the end of time, and it's really, you don't get a whole lot out of it. And
see, they're very interesting things that you're saying here, right? Sort of like underlying currents of our shared human psychology, right? Because you're saying, like, the person makes a point, and then rather than acknowledging the other person's point, right, they just are sort of like saying their spiel. So what you really want out of this is you want good conversation. You want reciprocity. You want, like, fairness. You want people to build off each other's ideas so that we're building towards some conclusion.
Yeah, not idea sex, but idea orgy.
That's right. You want an idea orgy. But most of what these things turn into...
And not all orgies are good. So
no. Let me... now, what? My unacknowledged children. But what a lot of these things turn into is it turns into two guys masturbating in separate corners. right? And they're just mentally masturbating. That's what they're doing, right? And it's like, I got my thought, and then it's like somebody over there is also having thoughts, and we're like, your thoughts are stupid, this is uncomfortable, right?
But what you need them to do is make eye contact.
That's right.
We're both ridiculous.
That's right.
Yeah.
And
like we look silly right now.
And that we do look silly, and that the only time that we look reasonable is when we're engaging with each other and building off of each other. But, you know, one of the interesting things that you're talking about here is, and it's like, I always enjoy talking to people. I was going to say I always enjoy talking to you, and I do always enjoy talking to you. But what I really is about is I really enjoy conversation.
Same here.
Conversation is not something that you get to have with everybody, right? So you're a good idea sex partner, right? And it is, you know, it is a building off of each other. But one of the things that you've drawn out here, which I think is really, really interesting, is that movements, right? Whether it's science or a startup, or even I think the early days of Christianity or Islam, they start from this place of being seekers and being curious. And we're going to ask questions that nobody's ever asked before, and we're going to try and figure it out, and we're going to keep trying to figure it out. But then at a certain point, they have, and even, you know, sort of like, I say the early days of atheism, right? But, you know, sort of a lot of where, you know, the most recent incarnation of atheism start off. They start off as seeking, but at a certain point, there becomes like this rigidity, and there becomes like, we've made these decisions, and we're not going to question those basic assumptions. And there are now powerful peoples. There's a king of this, right? Whether it's a king of atheism, or a king of science, or a king of this academic discipline, or a king of Christianity, a pope. And, you know, the point is that our job now, somehow, you know, our job is to fall in line. And like Animal Farm is actually, which I always, George Orwell I always loved, but Animal Farm is a really good example of that, because what happens is that, you know, it starts off like they're going to build this paradise for these animals and all this sort of stuff. And I can't remember if it's, it's really sort of, it's Boxer. Boxer is a great example. So Boxer in Animal Farm is the big horse, and he's just going to work harder than anyone, and he's going to make this paradise for animals. And like Boxer just like has this experience where increasingly he starts to realize, he remembers that things used to be different, that the rules were different, and somehow the system has changed around him without him even quite knowing how it changed. But that now somehow what we're supposed to do is sort of obey Napoleon and do whatever Napoleon tells us. And that's what happens with any sort of movement. But everything is a cult. It is. It's just that there are cults that are good cults, right? And there are cults that are bad cults. And, you know, it's really the social dynamics in the cult, where there are inclusive cults, where everybody can challenge everybody, and everybody is questioning everybody. And there are exclusive cults, where there is a leader, and we all sort of have to think a certain way, and there's a rigid orthodoxy, and nobody can question anything.
Can you really define, cult, if everybody is questioning and there isn't a leader? Is it still a cult?
No, it's still a cult. There's a shared set of values that we're rallying around, right? So, and where there's still a tribe, right? So think about you know, the early days of Apple, right? You know, it's no different than a tribal society. We've rallied around this symbol that is the apple, right? Does it matter whether the symbol was the apple or, you know, a little tiny, you know, the Windows of Microsoft Windows? Of course it doesn't matter, right? The symbol is utterly arbitrary, and then we imbue that symbol with meaning.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah.
They say the same thing with band names.
Yeah.
You know, same thing. Like, first time you hear a band name, you'll be like, oh, that sounds stupid. And
Yeah.
then it becomes your favorite band, and then you completely disregard your initial, you know, just opinion on the band name. Korn,
right.
for example.
Yeah.
I mean, first time I remember being a kid when Korn was coming up, and you know, same thing. I'm like, who the fuck is Korn with a K and a backwards R? This is so stupid. And then after a while, it's just like, it just becomes instead of you know, the name representing the band just it basically, or it did become that. It just became like, okay, this symbol, these lines that happen to say Korn, just basically represents this music I like, and that's all it is. And it's not, you know, it's not important what it actually says or what it looks like.
Of course, it's just a symbol, right?
Yeah.
But the same way, right? Like rock band is another great example, right? Group of people get together, right? And they're in a garage, right? Whether they're getting together in a garage to figure out an ideology or a rock band or a company, and they don't totally know what they're doing. We're just sort of here. We're a group of guys.
Sounds like my life, yeah.
Yeah,
when
exactly.
I first started a band, we didn't know what the fuck we're doing.
Of course.
We sucked big balls, and
that's right.
Our neighbors called the police on us, and looking back, I'm like, I know why they kept calling the cops when we sucked. Yeah,
but you start off there, and then you start fucking around, and pretty soon, the thing has a life of its own, and we started to evolve.
Well, and it's similar to what you're saying about creativity.
Yeah.
About so we're just taking all these pieces. Because I mean, similar to what we're talking about, how creativity is just gathering all these ideas and things, and then trying to put them together to see what makes sense. Music it's the exact same thing. Like, okay, I'm gonna play this guitar beat with that drum beat. Let's see how it sounds. Well, that doesn't sound right. Now try this drum beat with this guitar beat, and this is right. This is it. And you just constantly keep mismatching and trying to figure out what sounds right or what seems to make sense.
That's right.
But even some things like music, it's really interesting because it's like what makes something pleasant to listen to. It's like and it's funny because I always thought about this. I think it's very similar with ideologies. Like, why does somebody have or you share an idea, right? Or Sam Harris shares an idea, or Joe Rogan shares an idea, Chris Ryan, whatever, and I listen to it and I'm like, that shit makes a lot of fucking sense. And then somebody else will listen and be like, that shit makes no sense. And I'm like, well, what is that? And then I'm like, well,
that's education.
I think it's very similar to music, right? Why do somebody listen to a country song and love it? It hits a chord internally, emotionally. And I listen to a country song, I'm like, that is dog shit. Like, that is, like, I don't like it. I don't, and then I listen to a metal song, or I listen, I go see a band live, and I get goosebumps because the emotion in the song just goes through me. And I'm like, well, why don't we have the same reactions to the same things?
So the reason why I say that's education, right, is that, this is what, as an educator, you spend your whole time thinking about. Because what you're trying to do as an educator is get the pieces to fall into place. It's like Tetris, right? Or whatever it may be. And so, you can say the same sentence to one kid, and they're just like, holy shit, that makes so much sense. Now I get this concept. You go and say that same sentence to another kid, they don't get it at all. And what it is it's context. Are the surrounding pieces there for that to fall into place, right? And so, what do you find when because I've been doing a little research project over the last 6 months trying to really get to know, like, okay, what is the deal with Sam Harris's followers, right? Because I understand that Sam Harris is an example of a phenomenon that is happening around the world right now. There's a lot of radicalization.
And I think people forget that, because I think a lot of people online seem like they're obsessed with the idea that, like, it's like I'm like, Hunter has a bigger picture. Yeah. Like, it's not just about a personal grudge. He doesn't have a personal grudge with Sam. It's about what he sees with the issue that he sees with Sam. He sees everywhere, and he thinks it's a bigger issue, like this idea, like you said, this idea that you fall into this group and you join this team, then you defend it at all costs. And that's what you're seeing. That's what you're trying to highlight and explore. It's not, it's not just because I dislike Sam, so I'm just going to find a reason to and you're the perfect person to do this, because intellectually you can you can reference things that me, I don't have a great memory. I'll forget shit, but you can reference stuff. And it's a shame that we can't get, that somebody can't get you guys together and again, I mean, how much of this has to do with ego,
Oh, it's all to do with ego. But that's the interesting thing to me is that, Sam is like a gift. Like, I'm very grateful to Sam, right? Because, if you think about...
Gift from God?
He's a gift from God. No, but he's a gift because, like, if you think about trying to, if I wanted to go and try and understand fundamentalism by studying Islamic fundamentalism and by, challenging and pushing back on Islamic fundamentalists, the cost potentially of that personally is very high. They might kill me, right? Atheists...
And I think it's much more obvious.
Yeah.
Where I think this one has been, it's like a cult that like you're saying, everything's a cult, but this is a cult that doesn't, like, it's a bunch of people who don't realize they're in a cult.
Which is the best,
yeah.
Because it's like, what do you get them to do? What do you do to them to get them to be aware of that, to be aware of what they have baked in? And it has a lot of other good features. They're non-violent, right? So far. So therefore, you know, you can push back and you can challenge and you can learn a lot of things about, you know, human psychology and how you de-radicalize people. And then also, they at least nominally claim to be responsive to science. So the point is, I don't know that much about the Quran or, you know, the various schools of Islamic jurisprudence. So, like, I can't get into it with some Islamic fundamentalists and, like, sort of push back on them with that. I can get into it with someone on the science because I know that material well enough that I can challenge you and, like, potentially push back and find some interesting things. But what you find, right, with a lot of these guys is that a lot of them come from some sort of trauma, right, where they were in, you know, they were sexually abused, or they had some sort of bad experience growing up in a cult.
Kira Santa Maria.
Yeah,
for
exactly.
example.
Yeah. And so it's that very human thing of, you hate that thing, so you swing to what you see as the polar opposite, and you're like, man, I don't like punk rock, I like folk, right? And then you're over there.
It's rebelling. You're
it's rebelling.
Yeah, you're
right.
rebelling against, I mean, it's no different than, you know, I remember growing up and me and my brother being in a metal, and this girl that we, you know, that she was also one of the metalhead girls, and she loved Marilyn Manson, always wore Marilyn Manson shirt like every day to school. One day she didn't wear a Marilyn Manson shirt, and I'm like, why? I'm like, why don't you? Her name was Angel. I'm like, why don't you wear? Yeah, I know. And I'm like, why didn't you wear a Marilyn Manson shirt? I'm like, what's up with it? You don't like Marilyn Manson anymore? And she's like, no, my parents like him now. And I'm
oh,
like,
man.
And I'm like, really? And I'm like, I wonder how much their parents attempted to get into it because they thought that they would better understand their daughter,
of course,
or look hip or whatever, and it had the complete opposite reaction. Yeah. Where, like you were saying, you know, it's just.
And the point is that Marilyn Manson for her was really about doing something that her parents didn't like.
Exactly.
And the second that emotional context changed, now it's no longer appealing.
I have a buddy, one of my best friends is a detective, and he talks about how one of the worst things they can do is when they find a strain of pills or drugs or something like that's killing a lot of people. When they advertise that on the news, it goes up the usage, and that's because people are like, "Holy shit, that stuff's that strong, or that stuff is that dangerous," and it makes it sexy. It's no different than, like, you know, going to Europe, you know, being born in Portugal, going to Portugal, and wine and alcohol and breasts and all these things that are demonized in the U.S. And, you know, Thaddeus Russell talks about it, you know, our Puritan ancestors and how it's like, you know, all this stuff, and you know, and Chris Ryan talks about it with just like the suppression of sex and all that stuff, and it only makes things worse, you know.
And that's so much of, I think, probably what is driving people into the arms of ISIS. Right, ISIS, you know.
So, well, and they have no other options.
And they have no other options.
I had John Kiriakou on my show, who's a CIA officer who he did 2 years in prison because he's the one who exposed, or one of the guys who talked about publicly how the enhanced interrogation techniques were actually just torture.
Yeah.
And he talked about it, but he talked about meeting one of, like, what, you know, they captured one of the head guys in you know, in this terrorist group, and they have him. And he's there with them, and he's, you know, talking to him, and he's like, this kid he doesn't know anything about Islam.
Yeah.
He doesn't know anything about Islam. He's not even that religious. He's like, he just came from a poor area who had. It's no different than. Do I ever just finish a thought before I jump on to the next one? It's no different than, like, gangs in this, you know, in the cities. It's what you think, if they had opportunity, if they had jobs, or places to go to waste that energy and be a part of a community, they'd be joining a violent gang. No, they do it. It's like, I always say, I'm like, why aren't there gangs in the suburbs? I'm like, because we have other options.
That's right.
You know, I'm like, well, there's gangs there because they don't have other options. You know, when I had Rick Ross on, the drug trafficker.
Yeah, we had Rick Ross on.
Oh, that's
too.
right, you did too. That's right. Yeah, that's right, you did. And when you had when you talk to Rick Ross, I mean, that's one thing that he talks about is the fact that, selling drugs was just his only option to make any money.
Because he couldn't read.
He couldn't read, and he actually, speaking of tennis, he wanted to go to college for tennis, and
I think he had like a tennis scholarship or something like that.
But he knew he couldn't read. Yeah, he
so
couldn't read, so it was never gonna work.
But this is what's so dumb is, and I think this is, so now, okay, so path to dignity. People need a path to dignity and respect and, status in the community and the good life and all that sort of stuff. The American dream is not the American dream. It's the human dream, right? People want that everywhere, right? And like you say, that isn't there for a lot of people.
It's not there for me. I literally work a full-time job. And I'm luckily, it being family-owned, I have the perks of leaving early when I need to, like I did today. But, I mean, how many people are in my exact situation where I started my podcast for the purpose of feeling like I have some enjoyment out of life. Like I'm like I have this unfulfilling job.
Right.
I go to every day. I'm like I don't have anything that sparks my brain muscles, and I'm like, yeah, I can physically go to the gym and physically get a workout, but I'm like mentally I feel like I'm just getting dumber and dumber because I'm not working it out. And I'm like, and starting the podcast was something that I felt like I could do, that I'm like, I feel like I have a purpose now. I feel like I'm doing, I feel like I'm contributing. And I even called it the Ripple Effect Podcast for that reason, because it was the only thing that motivated me to even start the podcast was my true belief in the idea that we can all make a difference. And once you believe you can't, then you've lost. And if you don't think you can make a difference, the person who, somebody who thinks they can is the person who's going to change the world. And it's every great movement or change in the world that started off with some people and some ideas, and so that was me. And even when I started it, I had a lot of friends who were like, well, who's going to listen to you? And who's going to come on your show? And of course I had some positive people in my life who were like, yeah, do it, that's cool. But I had a lot of people who were like, yeah, and I had doubts, but it was one of those things where I'm just like, yeah, but what's my other option? Do nothing.
That's right.
It's there's somebody who said, I think it was a professional athlete or somebody who's like, I'd rather be they were talking about how athletes get a lot of shit now on Twitter and social media and all this stuff, and how it sucks, because before, if you had a bad game in the 70s or 80s in the NFL or in the NBA, if you're a basketball player, then maybe the newspaper will write about you. But today, you got tweets immediately from thousands of people talking about how bad you suck.
You're a bum.
Yeah, and then somebody said something like, I'd rather be the athlete out there being criticized than the spectator doing nothing, criticizing. And
or it's Teddy Roosevelt. Right? At the end, it's not the critic who counts, but the man who is in the ring, whose face is marred with blood, and who, although he fails, dared greatly doing it.
Oh, absolutely.
And there's
you ever meet an old guy who says, I wish I didn't chase my dreams? Yeah. No, you meet plenty of old guys who said, I wish I chased it further.
That's right.
or I invested more time and effort into it. Yeah.
And that's the point. The point is to be in the ring. And the ring is the internet. It exists, and all it takes for you to be in the ring is to step into the ring. And, to constantly be challenging yourself. And I mean, that's, it's funny. I think the last time we did, I don't know if we talked about this the last time we did the podcast, but I was playing around with this idea of the intellectual Thunderdome, right? That's what science is supposed to be, right? 2 ideas enter, 1 idea leaves. And that, these ideas are supposed to be tested against reality, and that, some of them die and they don't make it. And, I was like, that's not really happening in academia. Maybe we can clear out this space for doing it on the internet, where we would set these things up and we'd get people in. And I came to realize that you don't need to create an intellectual Thunderdome. We live in it. The world is an intellectual Thunderdome. The internet is an intellectual Thunderdome. And right now, ideas are fighting. And, there are lots of different contenders. And, a lot of the ideas that have been doing well up until now have been these sort of very simplistic ideologies that turn into tribalisms, where it's like, my tribe is the good tribe. Islam is the good tribe, right? And, atheism is the good tribe, and whatever it is. And
don't you think that's why they have a huge following? Because it's very easy to digest.
Of course.
Yeah.
It's a much, much more competitive offering.
Why do you think pop music does so well?
It's exactly right.
Easy to digest.
That's right.
It's simple. It's easy to digest. I mean, once something takes some effort. I mean, and probably a little bit has to do with evolution and, our constant search for the path of least resistance. Like, okay, we created a wheel, we created fire, we created these tools that make our lives easier and to get things done quicker and, more productively. So it's almost like we don't want to waste energy if we don't have to.
Of course not, and that's evolutionarily very smart, right? The point is that we are we conserve energy, right? And we don't do things that are unnecessarily hard. But it goes back to that point of education and context. What you have to do is that you have to move all of the ideas individually. There are all these different building blocks so that people have enough context that these ideas can fall into place. And the point is that once you know enough and once you understand these patterns enough, then all of those fundamentalisms become very unsatisfying. Because you're like, this is some simplistic, dumbass shit, and it doesn't make sense to me, right? And you and I have been evolving that playbook. That's what we've all been doing here, is that we're all making that clearer and putting those pieces together. And, I had an issue with Sam Harris that I couldn't fully clearly articulate 6 months ago. And then I came on, we had a conversation, and you're like, you need to listen to the Dan Carlin, Sam Harris podcast. So I went and I listened to it, and I was like, motherfucker, Ricky is right. Like, this is a damn fine piece of thing. And then other people told me, you need to go listen to the Josh Sepps, Joe Rogan, Hannibal Buress, Sam Harris thing. And I was like, oh my God, that is part of the thing too. And then, I've come to understand what is really going on here. But the point is that the issue is not Sam Harris. The issue is Sam Harris as part of a much larger phenomenon that is happening globally. And I now understand, okay, this is great, right? Because what we're really dealing with is we're dealing with people who have these very competitive offerings because they're very simplistic, and who's attracted to these people? It's people who are confused or who are somehow lost, often who are very young, and they're gravitating towards this because it provides something emotionally to them.
People who usually are victims of joining Scientology or any cult
or whatever it is. Or if you're a young guy,
not a coincidence that most people who join these cults are people who don't have a family or community that they feel a part of.
That's right. And then they're very small minority of the human population, but they're very noisy. And so what ends up happening is that and this is well understood in the world of Islamic fundamentalism, is that it's a very small number of spoilers. So the example that my dad gives is that there were 7 million people in Libya. Only 7,000 of them were Islamic fundamentalists. So it's a tiny fraction of the population, but they're noisy, they're willing to do things that other people aren't doing, and all you really have to do, it's not hard, it's just empowering the crowd enough so that the crowd is tracking the right thing. They're not tracking the what is being said or the justifications for the behavior, they're tracking the behavior. And they're tracking, the attitude, this arrogance, the self-righteousness, and the fact that, things like you're saying where you didn't really engage with his point, Sam. Like, he made the point that people rally around beliefs.
Yeah, but and the scary part is that there's people who listen to that podcast and think Sam...
Of course. But
made sense and...
Of course. And
made the most sense.
Yeah, and they're, I've been it's and like for example,
because I listened to that podcast and I was kind of surprised that more people didn't have the same, because that's exactly what I thought. I listened to this and I'm like, this is a great. I'm like, this is one of the first real good debates I've seen with Sam Harris where Dan did a great job of just articulating his perspectives and opinions, and because I think Harris had some respect for Dan, let him do it and in a way where you could listen to it and you'd be like, you know what, Dan's making perfect sense. Because I always say this, and it was like it was good that you needed a historian like Dan who could come up with the references on the spot, but it's an ideology and you can take it out and input another one and it wouldn't be any different.
Of course not.
And then what's the root cause? I mean, like the modern medical system, it's like, let's just look at the symptom, but let's not look at what's causing the symptom.
That's right.
And I think I say, I'm like, why isn't there terrorists blowing up people in Portugal? I'm like, because Portugal's not in the fucking Middle East.
Yeah.
I'm like, we're not. There's not our drones over Yemen. It's not our militaries that were a part of taking down Gaddafi and leaving Libya a fucking mess, or leaving Iraq a mess, or we're not a part of the British or French Empire that's carved up the Middle East, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and then had influence and created countries that shouldn't have been countries and all this stuff. I'm like, so when you look at history, it's not a coincidence that a lot of who they're rebelling against are people who have had some. Well, why do the Bloods hate police?
Yeah, that's right.
It's the same thing. It's because they. So it's the same type of thinking where this.
And listen, I mean, Marie, who is just in here, right? Marie grew up in Ireland. There's lots of terrorism there.
And Irish people are very politically smart because they are constantly reminded of their history and are usually very opinionated people. So. Which is good because it sparks conversation, which sparks thinking.
But and I grew up in one of the places I grew up in Greece, and we were the target of a terrorist organization, and that terrorist organization was not religious. It was very simply dedicated to removing all foreign influence from Greece. And why were they committed to that? Oh, well, it turns out that there had been a military junta that ran Greece for a long time. Guess who supported and backed them up? The United States. So,
they've been a part of proxy wars. Them and the Soviets in almost every part of the world.
So if you narrowly...
To Korea, you look at it, it's like Angola, the Soviets give weapons and money to one side and the other ones give money in.
Yep.
It's amazing how many world conflicts the U.S. and the Soviets have had a hand in, and
if it's all storytelling, right? Like I could look at my experience as a kid, growing up surrounded by armed guards, right?
How long were you in Saudi Arabia?
In Saudi Arabia, that was like only the first 6 months of my life, but Greece was when I was 6 to 8, so I actually really remember it.
Yeah.
And I could look at being surrounded by armed guards in
Brazil
Greece.
sometime too, right?
Yeah, in Brazil 3 years. But it's Brazil is another great example, right? You're there, and there are you're living in this amazing Copacabana, it's the beach. There are all these gorgeous topless women. People are wearing sunshades. But then just over there are the favelas, right? And there are people living in tremendous poverty.
Well, that's a huge problem with Brazil. It's like there's a poor and there's a rich. There's no middle class.
That's right. Wow. And you're hearing the gunfire at night and all of that sort of stuff. And it's like, why am I living in Copacabana while some kid is living in one of the favelas? Pure chance.
And that's the thing that drives me fucking crazy about people who are all, it's like, it seems like more and more people are more likely to be outspoken about certain ideas that they might have not been in the past, but because of who's president right now, I feel like people are much more likely to be outspoken about fucking people living off welfare and social blankets and and all this stuff that our taxpayer money is going to this and this and and that, and I'm just like, look, you have to understand the history. I'm like, you suppress a certain type of person. And I'm like, so, it's like, for example, for years and years, I got to learn soccer.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up playing, if I'm Portuguese, my parents let me play soccer. And then, so now we have this history of being very good at soccer. And we suppressed, blacks or whatever, or Spanish or whoever you want to suppress. You suppress these type of people, and you don't let them learn, read, watch, anything to do with soccer. Like, no. And now we're like, well, now we're going to make you equal. We'll let you. And it's like, well, what the fuck? How come we're better at soccer than you? How come you don't catch up to us? It's
That's
like,
right.
Because we suppressed you. Because we started, we got a head start, and now we want you guys to be like, hey, you know what? Everything's fair now. Come on, get your shit together.
But also because you've never fundamentally dealt with the underlying beliefs and assumptions that people have, right? So this is, Katie O'Brien, whose house we're at here in Nonquit. But, Katie, we spent a lot of time tutoring. And, you start off, it's like all of these things. Everything starts off superficial, and then you get into the core of what the thing is about, right? That's how learning really works, right? So, you start off with the dress or the haircut of being a scientist, right? People think that equate bushy hair with being like a scientist or being smart because they're like, Einstein had bushy hair. But being a scientist is not about bushy hair, guys. I have some news for you. That's like a non-functional feature. And then you work into really understanding the scientific method of, it's about testing all your own beliefs and challenging what you believe and constantly looking for holes. It's the same thing with tutoring. You start off, you walk in first day, you're like, my job is here to math and, help people with writing. But you come down to, what it's really about is giving kids the understanding of how learning works and how their thinking works so they can question their own assumptions and beliefs. But underneath it all, the core is there are certain assumptions. There are assumptions you've picked up about intelligence and how it works, And what you need to do is you need to teach people how to get it. How do you make yourself smarter? How do you learn the things that you want to learn? And it's the same thing with, you know, any society. Way, way, way underneath, right, African American culture, there are these beliefs and assumptions that have been internalized that were blindly copied as kids, right? The same thing with Hispanic culture, the same thing with white Anglo culture, the same thing with Portuguese culture, Greek, Arabic culture, and all that stuff. And that's what you really want to help people do, is excavate those things so that we can look at them, and then as individuals we can then decide what makes sense, what actually sets me up for success. And you get enough people doing that all around the world, then people will come to understand, oh, it's actually has nothing to do with being white or black or Hispanic or anything like that. It has to do with what works as a human for learning and for, you know, how we get smarter and how we evolve culture. And then, you know, at a certain point we all have enough role models in every culture that we're like, shit, this is reproducible, right? Creativity is not this magical thing. It's a thing. There's a process, and we can do that process and we can get it consistently. Learning and being smart is a thing. Any human can do this. And it's when we get to a stage where it's any human can do this that every human will start doing it. And then you have a whole different society and a whole different game. And that's the moment that we're living in history. Because in the old days, you know, we would have limited ability to get this message out, right? Or we would have limited ability to build this society. But now you and I can do this conversation, and people can rush in and they can rally around it. And it's not that all 7.5 billion humans are going to get it. There's going to be a guy in each village that's going to get it, and he's going to come here, or a gal, or whoever it is, and they're going to come here, and then all of a sudden it starts to become a movement. And there are enough people who are talking and thinking this way that now it's like, holy shit, there are millions of people who are doing this. And now it's a real thing. And now everybody else has to engage with it. They have to be like, what the fuck are these people doing over there in podcast land? They're having real interesting conversations. And they're really like changing things. They're making a difference. And then it's like, why aren't you guys?
Yeah, and that's why even with my podcast, I've had some people on my show who talked about this, how who the hell did I just have on recently? Oh, Dominic D'Agostino, who we were talking about this, I think, before we started recording. And, you know, this, I have musicians and comedians on because fans of theirs will come on and hear my conversation with Hunter and be exposed to something that they wouldn't regularly be exposed to. You know, most of the time when you're hearing an interview with the singer Fear Factory, it's in a metal magazine, or it's on, you know, a YouTube channel that only asks questions about music. And now I have them on, we're talking about how George Orwell 1984 was a big influence of his, and the future of technology and different philosophies and stuff. And then, you know, so it's I think that's really important. I think it's really, I think, you know, one of my goals is to do that, to get people to and just like your goal, like get people exposed to these ideas and different perspectives, and get people to and I think there are people out there who want it. They just don't know where to find it, you know.
That's right.
And you know, that's why, even, you know, it was funny because when I was initially talking to Adam about having you know, getting you guys together, I keep like restraining myself from calling it a debate, because I just you know, but he said it, he's like no, you need to call it a debate, because he's like it or not, you're gonna get more clicks, you know, and you're gonna get more people exposed to it. And I'm like, you're kind of right, you know, because I wanted to call it the Ripple Effect Roundtable, you know, just a conversation. And but he's right. If we call it, you know, Hunter versus, you know, I even did some, you know, some silly, you know, images of you and him versus one another,
duking it out.
Yeah, duking it out, you know. And it's just one of those things where it will get more clicks, and you know, and if it helps, it definitely helps. But I think you know, when you guys get together, you know, one of the goals is to have this, just, you know, idea sex, this, you know, just sharing of opinions and perspectives, and willing to be open-minded to other people's opinions and perspectives. Like we're saying, you know, in regards to atheists against religion, the Christian, you know, they're not open-minded to each other's ideas. It's all about defending their own ideas.
Of course, and defending their power. And their power comes from followers. And that is where power has always come from. Power has always come from the number of people around you. Why is Christianity powerful? Christianity is powerful because 1 billion people follow it.
Why did Martin Luther get shit for?
That's right.
You know?
He stole their followers.
Yeah.
You know, I
and
mean,
he stole their ability to dictate what it said and what
That's
it
right.
meant. Yeah, yeah.
and that's where power has always come from. It's not a social media phenomenon, it's a human phenomenon. The bigger your tribe, the more powerful you are. And so,
I'm sure you've known Chomsky, manufacturing consent. You know,
Yep.
it's same idea. Edward Bernays, this idea of,
Mhm.
of people who influence, or what's influencing you to want or desire something. Most of the time, you're not even sure of.
Of course not.
And there's so much that goes into that. You know, he completely rearranged the idea of marketing and advertising and propaganda. He wrote the book Propaganda.
Yeah,
and,
of course.
You know, took his uncle's research, and he's like, let's figure out how to manipulate the brain. Let's not just understand the brain, but how do we manipulate it? And so yeah, it's I think that's a big part of it. And this goes back to what you always talk about. It's like, you talking about, how does it make you feel? Why do you feel that way? And a lot of those reasons aren't easily found. It's not really easy to understand. And that's to go back to psychedelics and stuff like that. I think a lot of people get a lot of benefits from this out-of-body experience, because it makes you reanalyze, why do I feel a certain
Yep.
way, or why do I believe, or why am I a fan of this person, or why did I react this way when this person argued with me about this or brought up this topic. And you see it all the time. I've had conversations with people, and I'm sure you've had a lot of conversations with people where they seem so open-minded and very open to different ideas, and then you hit that one topic or that one subject, and all of a sudden it's like, what the fuck happened to this person?
Yeah.
Like, all of a sudden this person turned into a lunatic. Like,
you hit their fundamentals.
Yeah, exactly.
That's their so it's funny because you often have so many things floating around in your head, and you're like, oh, that's the same thing said a different way. And one of the ones that I've been really mulling over is there's this French term that my dad uses all the time, right? Because again, it's about cool, right? French was cool to the Dutch, right? Like that was, you educated people speak French, or educated people speak Latin. So like, you're woke as fuck if you speak French. So they would, often use little bits of French when they would speak, because that would make them cool. I'm cultured. Now I'm a great. It's no different than like, do you know the right punk bands? Do you really know what cigars are about, right?
Yeah.
Is it always?
Oh, you like that band, but do you know about this band? Everybody who likes punk knows this band. No, you're right. There is something to that.
It's always like, who's like really, it's the same.
Is it a little bit of trying to become like the alpha male?
Oh yeah,
intellectually
it's
maybe.
It's lacking. It's this primate behavior that's known as lekking, where humans try and primates try and demonstrate, like, I'm the big silverback, right? And
they say that's why people do extreme sports.
It's why people do so many things. We're trying to get status. I mean, extreme sports, and it's like, that's a really good example. One, it's about status. Like, I pushed this farther than anybody else was willing to push it. I pushed Islam farther than anybody else. I pushed atheism farther than I pushed whatever it is farther.
It's also attracting the opposite sex.
And it's just attracting the opposite sex, which is trying to gain status, trying to gain followers. It's also, part of it is that it's the adrenaline rush of having like gone out beyond the boundaries into new territory. And anarcho-capitalism is another great one, right? You think that you believe in the free market? I believe in the freer market, where there's no government, and we're just going to have this anarchy and just the capitalism.
And with all these ideas, and this is why, I think these conversations are so important, because I'm open to all of them. Like even the anarcho-capitalist, like the idea, like I do think there's a little bit of a good argument in regards to, I forget what town where they removed all signs and street lights.
Oh, that's a good example. So that's I read about it in Elegance, which is a book by something May. I can't remember what his first name is, but it's a Dutch guy who did that. So it was a Dutch guy who was studying traffic patterns, and he basically was like, humans are smarter at arranging this system than when you have these laws. So he like ripped out, I think it was from, I can't remember, Groningen or something like that, but he ripped out all the traffic lights and all the stop signs, and the system works much better because people show up to the the intersection, and they read the situation, they look at it, they evaluate it, and then they go. And there was another example like that where on some, the traffic around the DC area is nightmarish and hellish, and one day all the traffic lights broke down, and essentially traffic flowed better than it ever has, because what happened was that you unleash the social intelligence of humans to be able to read the environment, see the cues, and then know when to go or know when to not go.
Well, it makes perfect sense, because a lot, the thing is about a lot of Big Brother is the idea that like it's just doing the thinking for you, and it's just like, oh, you don't you don't need it to do any thinking. You don't need to look after yourself. We'll do it for you. And just put your trust in us. And so even with like street signs and street lights, you see it green, you go. You don't ever look.
That's right.
And why do a lot of accidents happen? Because somebody ran a yellow light, it turned red or whatever, and nobody looked because they just followed the light. They didn't bother to look because it's like, oh, the light told me to go. So you kind of remove the thinking away from it. So, but
there's a caveat. There's a caveat here.
Yeah.
So the caveat is that works well up until like 30 miles per hour, or whatever it is, because those are the speeds that the humans are used to thinking at. Once you start to get to 70 or 80 miles an hour, human reaction time just isn't good enough, and so that's when you start to need to have formalized rules, right? So the point is that it's like all of these things. There is reality. There is human biology. There's what the brain is set up well to handle and what it's not set up well to handle. And, would you want to cap speed limits at 30 miles per hour? No, you wouldn't. But then what with the tools available can you achieve? And the tools that were available in the 1920s or 1940s or 50s were having speed limits and having traffic laws and having whatever it may be. Now, not all cultures observe that, right? The Germans have the Autobahn. But ultimately, now that you start to have AIs and driverless cars, that makes new possibilities available to us. And so there are new adjacent possibles. And we'll have to keep on evolving a better and better system. But that's what you always want to do is that it's about empowering the social intelligence of human beings and designing a system where humans are included, where we can all be saying, hey, I noticed this missed opportunity, or I noticed this thing that could be better. How can we improve that? But inevitably what happens is, I think, the problem with anarcho-capitalism or anti-theism, just to distinguish sort of that crowd from, atheists, they sometimes call them counterproductive social justice warriors, the ones who are just so deep down that rabbit hole that they're actually not helping social justice at all, because they discredit social justice.
And you're seeing a huge movement against social justice warriors, because they've gone to the other extreme. I mean, you see Dave Rubin's show getting really big. Dave's been on my show, and when he came on my show, it was when he was very not politically opinionated. I mean, this is when he was doing the Young Turks thing, and he had the Rubin Report, and it was more just kind of a playful conversation about current events. And he went to this complete, anti-left, but he still calls himself a liberal type thing. And Rogan, very similar, where he and I get it. Like, I think there is a line that needs to be drawn. Like, it's going, like you said, there's extremes in all ideologies. It doesn't matter if it's left or right, or you have the alt-right, then you have the social justice warriors that are just completely over the top too. And
that's right. And so you're gonna the point is that the more that we're all realizing that actually the lines that we should be drawing are not around these tribalisms or around these ideologies, we should be drawing the line based on psychology, right? That really there are fundamentalists and extremists and radicals, and there are a tiny fraction of each of these groups, and then there are reasonables. And there's a large number of people who are fundamentally, on most topics, pretty reasonable, and really just want things to work, and work better than they've ever worked before, and, how do we really resolve this? And then you get together that basket of reasonables, and the more and more of us are just talking out our differences and trying to figure out a way forward that is productive, inclusive, and provides a really satisfying path to dignity for everybody. And, we're in that basket of reasonables, right? You've hung a name on, you know, there's a flag or a symbol, just like there's corn. There's the Ripple podcast. Okay, so that's that. Over here, there's another symbol, you know, mixed martial arts. That's great. Joe Rogan has his thing. You know, there are lots and lots of these different things. And, you know, even my buddy Sam Harris, you know, there are plenty of topics where it isn't his one thing, where he gets super rigid and defensive, where you can probably have a reasonable conversation with him about plenty of things.
I actually, every once in a while I do listen to the Waking Up podcast because, you know, I think it is important to listen to people you don't agree with.
Yeah, of course.
You know, and same thing with Twitter and Facebook and whatever, you know, it's, I think it is important to listen to the other side. You know, I was just talking to somebody about the documentary What the Health, and, you know, it's just like this anti-meat documentary. I think it's the same guys who did Cowspiracy. And remember, did you ever watch Cowspiracy?
No,
but it's a hilarious name.
It's amazing. You know, but see, this is the opposite of your buddy that you were talking about earlier. That name is so good.
It is, and it sounds so ridiculous. It doesn't even sound like Cowspiracy. I'm like, how do I take something like that serious?
Yeah, it's amazing.
Well, it's funny because I think. So I was booking somebody and they were a client of theirs and like, hey, do you guys want to, you know, this seems right down your alley. These filmmakers they did a film called Cowspiracy, check it out. So I checked it out and I'm like, I'm a carnivore, man. I don't know if I could talk an hour or 2 hours about how much you know, how dangerous eating meat is and do it in a serious manner and not just feel like, you know, I have to argue with them or debate them. So I'm like, I don't know. I don't think I feel comfortable. So and then eventually I ended up going on Joe Rogan's podcast, and they said a bunch of statistics, and this goes back to how you can find statistics to back anything. Yeah. Well, Joe didn't have all the statistics in front of him. These guys came prepared. So at the time, he's kind of just like agreeing with it or whatever, and then a show or two later, he ends up bringing up that show that he did with the Cowspiracy guys, and he's like, well, apparently I got a lot of emails. They were kind of wrong when they said this, and that statistic was kind of, you know, kind of skewed and this and that, and you know, and that's kind of a dangerous thing because you can find statistics to back any perspective.
But you also have the episode 2 episodes later where you're like, apparently that was total shit. So what you're seeing here.
But the other thing too is the fact that it's not always a bad thing that these people who are motivated by their hatred of meat or whatever it may be actually do expose some good information. You know, because in the documentary there was some information that was, you know, anti, you know, processed foods and processed meats, and stuff, which I completely agree with. And there's some statistics in there that I do know a lot of other people agree with and make sense, and you know, there's good research to back it. So I think that even in extremism, you know, the extreme left, extreme right, they do, like I always say, you know, I remember growing up and reading articles, and, you know, I would always tell myself, like, listen, I'm going to look at the information, I'm going to disregard who wrote this article and what his personal opinions are, because in this article, maybe if he doesn't have his morals aren't why he's exposing this corruption on the other side. It's because he just is backing his team, but in that process, he might still get some good information.
Well, it's no different. I mean, you know, all of these social dynamics, right? They play out between two people, and then you can see them playing out between two cultures. It's the same thing, right? So I think about like some of the best life-changing advice that I've gotten from people is from people who were just really pissed off at me. And they reached back for the worst thing they thought they could say at me. You know, and I had this conversation with Brett Vanoiti. Yeah, Brett, is it Venat? Like, I fuck up his name so badly. I can't. How do you pronounce it?
Venat.
Venat.
Yeah, from the School Sucks Project.
Yeah, and the point is that's not, you know, it's like...
Not the easiest name to remember.
Well, no, it's just that the match between how it's written and how it's said are not the same at all, right? So I'm trying to, like, go off the spelling.
Yeah,
and,
that happens to me all the time.
It's not at all. So Venat. Okay. Yeah. So Brett Venat, thank you for that. But, you know, we were having this conversation, and he called it resentment fireballs. And, like... You know, when you get, like, this hateful-ass shit thrown at you, you can be pissed at it. But I've come to love it. Because what it is that, you know, humans are amazing at seeing the splinter in each other's eyes and terrible at seeing the log in their own. So there's I have lots of shit that I need to deal with and work on that I can't see. And when you throw that resentment fireball at me, right, if I try and bat it away, I'm missing out. I'm like, let that sucker come in and burn that log in my eye. Because it's usually what it is that it's people seeing the things about yourself that you're blind to. And, you know, we spend so much time trying to deflect that criticism away. But the more you embrace it, the better off it gets. And so what you're talking about with cultures is that cultures are doing the same thing. They're running around, the Cowspiracy guys are running around and they're trying to defend their argument. And they're trying to find what are the best arguments we can make to make meat look bad. And some of the stuff that they get is bogus and misleading, but they do find some gems.
Exactly.
And the point is that what we're living in terms of this humanity's intellectual thunderdome is that we're now all, you know, there's always been a hive mind, but the hive mind of humanity is now connected up to a much greater degree in terms of just the pipes technologically than it ever has been. And now all this information is flying like crazy between it. And ultimately, you know, this is why, I mean, Katie uses this great analogy that what we're living through is humanity's first family dinner. So all these cultures of the world, just like members of the family, have been off in their little corners for so long. And now, because of globalization and the internet, we've all been shoved together at this table. And, you know, we've lived through these periods of the internet. There was the like, oh my God, it's so good to see you. We should get together more often, right? And it was so exciting because like suddenly all this information was available. And then all of a sudden we got to the main course and all the resentments and the anger and all the grudges have come out. But now I think our job is to help transition, you know, the more and more of us are helping transition towards like, okay, like a lot of shit has been said. Some of it is just hateful and hurtful, but so a lot of it you got points here. So let's actually talk these things out and resolve our differences. And you know, if we, in terms of what comes next for the internet, that is really what comes next for the internet. Is that more and more of us start having conversations like this, where we're actually trying to really talk things out. And you know, that's how we actually figure things out. And we're like, okay, turns out that we don't really know how to build a society that is really great. Like really an awesome global society that offers people prosperity and inclusivity and feelings of community and embeddedness. Because even, for example, the weirds, right? Like, you know, that culture of like the college educated crowd that I come from, right? They talk endlessly about community. They're like, community, community, community. Why do you think they talk about it so much? Because they don't know how to fucking build it. It's the thing they want and they don't know how to get. They're so busy being like, trying to be dignified and smarter than everybody and, you know, trying to be individualistic, and they just hunger for that community. And that's a lot of what they see in the African American community or what they see in the Hispanic community that they hunger for.
Well, it's funny because it's almost become counterproductive, the idea of like, oh, let's put all these minorities in a small little place where they're all living together in apartments and stuff like that. And we're like, oh, fuck them. We live in the suburbs where I have privacy. And and then who's the ones with anxiety and depression issues? The ones in the suburbs.
Of course.
Now, you know, there's a guy who was on the Rogan podcast not too long ago. He did that documentary. I believe it was on Syria. It's something about hell, whatever. But it was on Nat Geo, and it was all about you know, how bad that is. But he's done a bunch of other documentaries like Respo.
What is it? It's not.
What's his name? If you said his name,
I can't remember his name, but then Restrepo. Restrepo is the documentary.
And then he just wrote a book called Tribe. And,
Sebastian Younger.
Yes.
That was the link that I needed. Okay. Tribe is amazing.
Yeah. Oh, did you read it?
Yeah, it's one. I read it last year, and it just crystallized a lot of things that you'd known. Yeah, and it's community and tribe and
these
embeddedness.
And these people in the military who actually missed being there,
of course,
being in these dangerous environments. But it wasn't because they actually missed in dangerous environments. It was because they missed the community. They missed the
band of brothers.
Yeah.
You know, that as Shakespeare wrote about in Henry the Sixth, Fifth, something, or one of the Henrys. Anyway, but you know. We lucky few, we band of brothers, right? Like that, but that's, you know, why is Shakespeare writing about that? And why does that phrase stick out? Because what Shakespeare got down to is he got down to those core human experiences of tribe that we have wanted for so long, and that we know and that we miss. And and that's what people want. People want that tribe, and they want that sense of community. And what's great is that now, there's a massive experimentation going on the internet with different ways of organizing tribes and communities. And they're organizing around different political ideologies. And people are ping-ponging between them, right? In the same way that they've always ping-ponged between them. And, when you're talking about, like, oh my God, I'm going to Marilyn Manson. Why am I going to Marilyn Manson? Because my mom and dad hate it. Now my mom and dad like it. Now I'm going to run to this. But in the end, hopefully, I don't know where Angel is or what's going on with Angel, but hopefully Angel gets down to what this is really about, is the fact that I want to do what my parents hate. And why am I really trying to do that? And then there's a process of sorting through whatever those feelings are. And that's what really is what everybody needs, right? There's a whole bunch of emotional stuff cooking there under the hood. And, we all need help sort of sorting through that. And the great thing is that the solution to doing that is each other. It's not going to come from, the technology will enable us to have those conversations. But as you say, a lot of it is using the technology to find people with whom you can have those conversations, and then meeting up offline. Face to face, and having a conversation, and we all help each other sort through our baggage. And, that could happen very quickly. Could be that tomorrow or whenever this thing, if it ever gets released, people listen to it and they're like, man, that's what I need. And that we all go and, for the month of August, right, we just all go and have these conversations offline, and we all sort through the shit we picked up from our moms and dads and, the people around us. And then September, we're like, wow. We all dealt with our emotional baggage, and now what we're going to do is go and figure out how we need to change things to make them better. It could be that fast. I don't know that it will be, but that's the work, and that's what we really need to do. And if we do that, we're going to get amazing rewards. Our society is going to be way better, way more productive, way happier, and way more prosperous. And that's all it takes.
Yeah, well, I think that's why the younger generation, they're much more likely to be open-minded. I mean, look at like socialism, when we were growing up. I mean, you use socialism. I mean, people look at you like you're an alien, or, like this, it was just demonized word. And then we had somebody who ran as an open socialist, and it was publicly accepted. And I think it's because you have the younger generation that just, wasn't alive during all this propaganda and has access to all this information that can cut through any current propaganda, and they're a little harder to trick, and a little harder to fool, and
they also have a very acute problem. And the point is that the American dream has taken on many forms throughout history. And the version of the American dream that appeared after World War II, which was, you go to college, you get a degree, you get a good job, you stay in that job for the next 40, 50 years, then you can buy the house and you can have the good life and whatever. And that is broken down, right?
I think people realize that doesn't bring you happiness.
Well, they realize it doesn't bring you happiness, and even if you wanted to pursue that, right, I think there's a couple of things. One, there's like the raw sort of mechanics of that, right? College, the price of college has just gone through the roof, right? It's just gone up and up and up and up. And then we see what's actually happening on college campuses, and we're like, I don't think you're getting $250,000 worth of value there. I don't think you're really getting an education. And then the gap between what it takes to have a successful career and what you get in college has just gotten so wide, because there are no stable careers anymore, right? The world is constantly changing, and so it's about learning, unlearning, and relearning, and that information is all available online to teach yourself.
I have a buddy who's a teacher, and he's like, well, I teach kids anything they can look up.
That's right. And so what you really want to teach them is to learn, unlearn, and relearn, right? How do I use the internet to teach myself whatever is required? And so all of the sort of those old things, which a lot of them were dictated by what was the current technology, are falling apart. But the other thing too is that there is a large part of what makes the sort of the traditional good life work is other people. So it's the fact that I have the big house, and what am I getting from the big house? Well, I'm getting the big house, sure, but really what I'm getting is that everybody is like, did you see Ricky's house? Ricky's got a house, and it's got this feature and this feature, and he's got the big flat screen TV.
Yeah, absolutely.
And the flat screen TV is irrelevant. What we really want is the status. And if it was, and that's when you move between enough cultures, you realize that status is marked out actually in a whole bunch of different ways, right? And what do you do to get status in extreme sports? You push it to a place that nobody else is willing to go to. One of my favorite examples is in Islam. There's this thing called the zabiba. And the zabiba is the Arabic word for raisin. And it's a little knot or welt on your forehead that you develop from having prayed so hard. Like, you have, like, just done it to the degree where, like, now there's a permanent welt on your forehead. Well, guess what? People have figured this thing out, and some people just take a rock to their forehead and rub it and agitate it until they develop a welt, right? But the point is that, you aren't in that culture. So you see a guy with a weird lump on his forehead, and you're just like, why does that guy have a weird lump on his forehead, right? But if you're an Islamic guy and you're in that culture, you're like, man, look at the zabiba on that one. That's a big zabiba.
Sounds like hip-hop culture.
That's right.
And butt implants.
It's the same thing.
I look at it, I'm like, that looks ridiculous.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so there are all these different status markers, but a large part of it is that, what happens is that at a certain point people realize that people are faking the zabiba, and then instead of it becoming a thing that's impressive, you're like, that is like definitely not real, that's fake, that guy is doing that. And it's the same thing, at a certain point we're all wise to the butt implants. And I think that a large part of what's happened is that increasingly we've all come to understand that the person who needs to like flaunt all that wealth is just covering up some sort of deep-seated insecurity. And so,
of course.
And so now instead of it giving you status, it actually takes status away from you. Because we're like, what is wrong with that dude that he feels the need to do that? And how does status then shift? Then it becomes, I think that increasingly status will shift to what it's actually evolved for. And so what its status is evolved for is who contributes the most to the tribe, right? So there are these two axes of power in humans. There's dominance, which is sort of the big, like, let me make myself large and big, and there's prestige. And prestige is like, man, that guy, every time he goes out, he brings back a big deer, and he then divvies it up all around the tribe. That's the guy you want to be, because that's the guy who is valuable to the community. And I think that's what increasingly what the hive mind is figuring out is like, okay, Kim Kardashian has billion followers or whatever, but does she really contribute anything of value to the community? Is she helpful, right? What does she do to like help the next generation succeed? Is she instilling the sort of values that we want? Okay, Sam Harris has 1 million followers, but why does he have 1 million followers? Well, he's managed to gather around him a bunch of people with religious trauma, right? Okay, yes, this guy has, a whole bunch of money, right? He made a G today, but he made it in a sleazy way, right? And so the wiser that people become
but I don't think people care about that.
I think they. I think
when it comes down to, I think we've, you look at it like hip hop, for example, like
right.
Being a boss, being tough, not taking shit, like that's it's a sign. It's a good thing. It's a good aspect of your character that
in that culture,
but in many cultures. But look at just like throughout. For example, you're right. It's in that culture, but I think unfortunately the majority of our culture has been basically we look up to people, or at least we're told to look up to, like, okay, what's success? We've been basically brainwashed to believe success is financial or material.
Mm-hmm.
And so the person with the most financial or material success, those are people we look up to. And those are people we want to be. Those are people we envy. And to do that, we know that you have to be an asshole. You have to cut corners. Being in construction, I'm constantly communicating with other, we're a small family little business, but we do work. We're big contractors. I don't like any of them. Like I've met these guys who are, and I'm sure you have too. Met guys who are multi-millionaires, and you might be you're Saudi prince. Who knows? But I mean, this house could, But
I'm actually. It's very exciting. I should announce it. I'm actually officially now a fake millionaire because I'm part of a startup, and the whatever options I've been given have been valued at $1 million.
Nice.
Right. I've been a fake millionaire before, by the way, and then that startup failed. So, the
but
point
even
is...
Trump filed for bankruptcy once or twice,
So, but it's very easy to become a fake millionaire. You just have to start a company and then value your company at like $1 million. And then now you're a fake millionaire and you have, 100% ownership share in fake $1 million company.
But I think it was Graham Hancock who said, one of the problems with society is that we care more about what type of car you drive and not how many rides you give with that car. Mm-hmm. And it's a very simple way of kind of saying a very important thing. And I think that's, and this goes back to what we're talking about, manufacturing consent, marketing, propaganda, the way they market things today. Every time there's a Cadillac or Jaguar commercial,
right.
It's a guy in a suit.
Mm-hmm.
It's a guy with a beautiful wife and an expensive watch and a nice house and all this stuff. So what ends up happening is that they don't sell you the car. They don't sell you the it's a guy with an English accent, but every time they sell you a pickup truck, it's a guy with a deep voice. Why do they choose to do that? They choose to do that because when you look at the pickup truck, you think blue collar, get my hands dirty, and that's the image I want. I want to give, so I want to buy that truck, and people are going to get that image. So what I'm buying is the image that I'm getting with this vehicle, with this product,
Mm-hmm.
and I have buddies.
But see that here's the let's reframe the problem.
Yeah.
Right. The real problem is a lack of self-awareness, right? So the point is you understand this. I understand this, right? There are people who understand this. There are people who don't understand this, right? Who aren't self-aware enough to understand that, every culture has its Zabiba, right? Everybody has something that they're aiming for. And what they're really aiming for is they want people to think they're cool or to look up to them. And, what's exciting about the internet is that suddenly, this humanity's first family dinner. And up until now, everybody has been freaking out about what the other members of the human family are doing. But when you line up for people and you show people the patterns and you start to realize, all of this massively counterproductive behavior is actually about people trying to pursue status and trying to be valued, right? And that actually, sure, this, having a welt on my forehead as a Zabiba may make me cool in this culture, but in other cultures, they either don't give a shit or they think that's dumb, right? Then increasingly people are going to be like, man, why am I pursuing status this way? And then you have to start thinking about, actually, what do I care about? What is important to me? And that's what we want to get to, is we want to get to a society where people, if everyone starts questioning these things, and they already are to varying degrees, then what ends up happening is that you get to that place that Steve Jobs talks about, where everybody realizes, Steve Jobs has this great line where he says, most of your life you're told, not to bash around against the walls too much, right? That there is a world, there is a way that it works, and that, your job is to maybe have a little fun, save some money, but try not to shake things up too much.
Part of it.
Part of the system, right?
Yeah.
And he said, and that's a very limiting way to live. And then there comes a moment when you realize that the world was built by people no smarter than you, and that if you want, you can remake it. And that's the possibility here that the internet makes possible, the adjacent possible. That
you're
next
making the argument
level.
for anarcho-libertarians.
No, I'm making.
Let's remake it. Let's rethink our society. But
it's not. But the point is that the anarcho-capitalists want to throw it all out. I want to iterate it. So the point is that there are all these things that exist, and then now we have to. It's the same thing as the traffic signs. Right? So we have to really question all of these things and really look at what makes sense. And we find out, okay, actually, having traffic signs up to, say, 30 miles per hour in cities, with the right sort of, street design does make sense. We want to rip that out. But comes this place 30 miles an hour where we actually do want to have signs and we do want to have rules because of what our brains can and can't do. And that's really what we want to be doing, is getting to a stage where we're constantly looking at, okay, if we do this, what happens to the system? Does it work better or does it work worse? And so we're constantly, it's...
But again, aren't you almost contradicting what Steve Jobs said? You're saying, if we do this, what happens to the system? But how about can't we just rethink the system?
We can.
And in other words,
but
agree that the system that exists we shouldn't have to even find solutions for that. That it's possible that we could just rethink the whole thing. That's why I like, anarcho-capitalists. I like their passion and how they're looking at the bigger picture. I like the Zeitgeist movement, Peter Joseph. Why? Because they're looking at the bigger picture. And the thing is, when you're around kids, one thing you learn is that everything they believe and everything they think isn't because in the natural world this is the way things have to work. It's because we've been telling them this is the way things work, because we were told this is the way things work and this is the system they have to be a part of.
Right.
And you maybe can start fresh. Maybe we can rethink things. Maybe we can.
I think we can intellectually start fresh, but I think there's an important thing to bear in mind, right? Is that a lot of these movements are like your friend Angel. They're emotionally reacting against something. So what is anarcho-capitalism emotionally reacting against? It's emotionally reacting against the growth of government, right? And so you're like, okay, why not have no government? And it's like, that's a fine thought experiment. But you can go to plenty of places without government. Places like Libya, after you tear down Gaddafi, you remove government. And what happens? It descends into anarchy and tribal violence.
But some people will say when there was government, it was maybe not equally as bad, but also not good.
No, and the point is that it wasn't good, right? But what you're talking about...
Look at our government, for example. I've heard you, I think you used the example with the EPA, I believe. And but one of our biggest... FDA, yeah. One of the biggest polluters is the Pentagon. I mean, it's our military doing experiments in the ocean and all this stuff. So, and that's a part of the government. So
there are conflicts of interest there, right? But you have to... So,
my thing is, I don't think the problem, and I think you agree that the problem isn't either or.
No.
It's always just there's corrupt people who are going to do corrupt things and only care about their interests and not others. And it doesn't matter if they, end up finding their way into government or find their way into being a CEO of a company. They're going to react and act the same.
The problem is human psychology and human behavior.
Exactly. Yep.
And that has always been the problem. And the question is, how do you...
Government doesn't breed greed. No. Greed exists regardless of government's there or not. Yeah.
And so the problem has always been human psychology, and how do you... And that's not a problem at the level of a tribe, right? At the level of 150, this Dunbar number, I can track everybody in the village. And I can be like, Joe Rogan and I talked about right? So, Ung is the guy who never goes out and gathers guavas, but always eats a shit ton of guavas, right? And Ung is a piece of shit, right? And the problem of Ung is something that at the level of the tribe is easy to fix. Because I'm like, you know what? Fucking Ung. Ung always eats the guavas and never goes out and gathers them. And then we figure that out, and either we go beat the shit out of Ung, or we kill Ung, or we exile Ung, or we just are like, hey, Ung, this time it's your turn to go out and get guavas. So we're able to handle that behavior in small groups. The challenge is that when you start to reach a society of 300 million, it is I don't even see most of the Ungs. I don't know what's going on, and people are trying to solve those problems, right?
Like that quote, I don't know if it was Stalin or who said that if one person dies, it's a tragedy. If a million people dies, it's a statistic. Yeah.
Which, by the way, was not said by Stalin, but the hive mind, the genius of the hive mind is nowhere
equally as bad.
Well, no, but the genius of the hive mind is nowhere clearer than with quotes, because all of these quotes, quoteinvestigator.com. Like, if you want to see the hive mind working, quoteinvestigator.com is a great place to go see it.
I didn't even know that existed.
Oh, it's a great site. I constantly go to it, and constantly you find that...
I won't constantly go to it, because I will constantly realize that I'm wrong over and over.
No, you'll realize that every single one of these quotes was never said by the original person.
And some of them probably never even said it.
No, not at all. And in fact, what's happened is that you'll find that it's a tool. And the hive mind has shaped the tool to be better than it was. So there's a thing that was said, they then shaped it into a better line, and then they paired it up with the person who would make that line best. So you couldn't think of a better person to have said, you know, the death of one person is a tragedy, the death of a million is a statistic, than Joseph Stalin. So they did that. They put that together. And again, you'll find, oh, yeah, that's
Is that
what
who they contributed to? Because there is, I think, is it Stalin that they contribute that?
Sometimes you see it with Stalin, and that's what you'll also find is that people have paired this line up with 5, 10 different people.
In like 20 years, it'll be Trump.
That's right. That's right. And, you know, and why? Because that is what is needed at the time. That's the story that's needed at the time.
Well, I think the important thing, and you being an educator, you would know this, it seems like much, and Daniele Vignelli, you know Daniele Vignelli?
Yeah.
He, you know, he's one of the guys, he was one of my first guests ever on the show, which I still give him tons of props for, because till this day I'm like, why the fuck you come on my show? I had like 4 episodes and nobody listening.
Yeah.
But super nice guy. But he one thing that he constantly said, because he very smart guy, wrote his first book, I think in Italian when he was like, I don't know, 16 or something like that, published his first book, or 18 or whatever it was. And he always talked about how, like, because at this time, you know, when I first started the podcast, I was still very, and I still am, very self-conscious and insecure about my intellect. Like my, you know, I always feel like I'm, you know, like just, I'm looking up to these people who are much smarter than me. And it's because of this, you know, this information that they have that I don't, you know, and what Daniele would always say, which to me made perfect sense and kind of made sense on how my brain works, is he would talk about how he's like, well, information for knowing information isn't important. Well, how does it relate to your life? Does it add something to your life? Does it add something to your thinking? Does it add something to your perspective? If it doesn't, then just knowing information, and it makes you remember what intellect really is, and what, you know, do you consider somebody smart who can share a personal story or some personal opinions that really shape your thinking, or somebody who can just regurgitate names and dates and facts? But see,
that right there tells you why Danielle came on your podcast when you only had 4 episodes and no followers, because that's what it was, and he wasn't interested in that.
Yeah,
there are some people who are playing that status game with the podcasting world, and they're like tracking, like, who's a big deal, and like, what's this gonna do for my career? And really what you're being motivated by is your ego, right? And then there are some people who are interested in having, like, for me, I don't really care. Like, I'm interested in, you know, helping humanity's first family dinner go better. So I'll talk to anybody. I don't ask how many followers or listeners you have. I don't give a shit. I'll talk to people on Twitter. I go in YouTube comments, right? Because what I'm trying to understand is I'm trying to understand the psychology. I'm trying to understand where these people come from, what their deal is. And I understand that ultimately what it's about is it's about shaping narratives that are better and better and better. And the better and better the storytelling gets, and the clearer the storytelling gets, the more these ideas will move, right? And, you know,
and like I said, some of the most interesting people aren't based on their popularity or how famous they are. You're not
Maria
famous.
O'Reilly,
yeah,
right?
And
you know.
yeah, and look at yourself. I know that your conversation you had with Rogan, I saw a lot of positive feedback on that, and people who weren't familiar with you, like, this guy's really smart, you know. And it's like, yeah, this might be one of your favorite shows in the last couple months, and if not ever, and yet a lot of you guys might have not even known who he was. You know?
That's the fun. That's the fun of the internet. Is that, you know.
Well, this goes back to status too.
Yeah.
Because it's like this idea of like status affects your opinion of their opinion.
Of course.
So it's like, so you put not just them, you know, on this you know, this up above us all looking down, but you put their opinions there too.
Yeah.
So it is one of those things where, unfortunately, who is stating the opinion also has an effect on how we you know, perceive the opinion.
And that's I think the only reason to want status is because it's a tool, right? It is a tool.
More people listen. More
people listen, and they'll take it seriously, and blah
opinion.
blah blah blah. But, you know, the point is that we all get to, you know, in the United States, right, and in many other countries of the world, you get a political vote, right? Everywhere in the world, you get a financial vote, right? Like, you buy from one vendor in a market versus another vendor in a market, you're assigning power to one versus the other, right? And, you know, you also in the internet, right, you get to get people status, right? You like them, you retweet them, you know, listen to their thing, you download, you recommend, and, you know, we're all assigning that. But the point is that, you know, and the same thing with a rock band or anything like that. And what you're doing is that you're changing the makeup of the conversation, right? So you're saying, like, everybody is essentially upvoting, okay, this person's voice needs to be heard more. This person's voice reflects me, what I feel, what I'm feeling right now. But what you're feeling changes, right? So right now, you know, you're super angry at this experience that you've had, but then you work through it. And, you know, now you have a different set of feelings. And now you're like, oh, I'm much more interested in being a seeker rather than being angry and self-righteous in this way or that way. And so therefore I listen to the Ripple podcast. And so now I want Ricky to have the Ripple Effect. There you go. It's okay. People, Bryan Callen can't even remember the name of our podcast. He's constantly like mixed, martial, mental, that you know.
And it is the perfect name. When you guys came up with that name and you're thinking of changing it, I'm like, that's a great. Well, one, changing it's a great idea because you start hosting more shows than he did, but also because that's, you know, it is exactly what you guys are doing.
Yeah,
you know?
And the ripple effect is exactly what you're doing. And you know, but it's like all of these things, right? You know, how well known is any of this stuff, right? And you know, and that's fine. But the point is that I think that we're going to see, you said this about sort of the round table that we're supposed to call a debate, that there is a hunger for these conversations.
I believe so, yeah.
I think there is a hunger, there's a profound hunger. I think people are, we had the cat fights, we had the like, my tribe is right, your tribe is an idiot experience, and part of it is just, it's boring. It's boring entertainment, right? We've had that experience, we're fed up with it. Now there's a hunger for more like actually resolving differences. So I think part of what's going to happen is that podcasts like ours that are really for people trying to figure it out and being seekers are going to see a rise in popularity. And you know what? Like,
well, because our podcast has become therapy.
That's right.
Because, like you said, it's soul searching. It's self-analyzing, self-reflecting, and I think people do need that, because if they didn't, that's, you know, it wouldn't make any sense that people are constantly self-medicating with alcohol and pills.
That's right. And so I think that you're going to see this shift. And you're going to see this shift where I think there are going to be a lot more seekers and a lot more people wanting this. And, you know, it may be that you and I, you know, in a year from now, if we have this conversation back here at Non-Quit, suddenly we're both big deals, right? And, you know,
I hope so. I hate my full-time job.
And that's great. The point is that you have the experience of being a big deal. But what's important to realize is that power of any form is a public trust. And the public have entrusted us with a certain amount of power, and more of the public may entrust us with more power. But guess what? If we then abuse that power, they're going to snatch that away so fast. So you better be thinking of power as like responsibility, and that you are serving the community with it. Because if not, they will take that back so quickly, right? And you've seen lots and lots of celebrities have a fall from grace. And it's because you use that in a way that I don't approve of. Snatch. So it's the same thing with...
But couldn't that type of thinking prevent you from also being outspoken or passionate about something?
It exactly can. And that's the problem, is that, you know, very often people start, you know, modifying their opinion based on that. And I think that's part of the problem with, you know, what you're talking about with Dan Carlin, or what you're talking about with John Haidt, is that, you know, Dan Carlin or John Haidt work within, you know, John Haidt has the rules of academia, and the rules of academia is that we have to speak in a certain way, and we have to be polite, and we have to not call a spade a spade. So John Haidt has to go on Sam Harris's podcast and, you know, have this conversation. Now, for those of us who know the relevant biology, the science, we know that at the beginning, John Haidt like planted his flag. They're Haidt's 2 Easter eggs, and he said, here are the 2 big differences between Sam Harris and I: rationalist versus intuitionist, and, you know, multi-level selection. And that's the whole thing. And he said it right there. And he's like, but essentially what he then did in the rest of the podcast is like, we're not going to really talk about the 2 elephants in the room. Instead, we're going to have a polite conversation and sort of do all of that. And that's what John has to do. And, you know, if John had his druthers, right, he would probably do things differently. And I said that in a tweet. John liked the tweet, because he's got to play by those rules of the system. His hands are tied. I don't have to do that.
Yeah, you, Christopher Rhines,
Yeah.
Danielle Bignoli, who's not a full-time professor.
That's right.
Dan Carlin, who's not, he even, doesn't even use the term, historian, because he's like, I don't
That's
have
right.
the credentials, I don't have the paper, like
Yep.
you said, the thing that college gives me to say that I'm officially, but yet he knows equally or more than many historians. So, but I think those people are the most interesting, because people like yourselves can...
No,
you don't have to toe a line.
We don't have to toe the line, and so we have the freedom to do that. But part of what I think we're going to do for the John Haidt of the world is that we're going to get the cat out of the bag. And, part of my job, I think, is to essentially be like John the Baptist, right? You need the crazy-ass guy in the wilderness who is screaming about shit and saying things that nobody else is allowed to say that then prepares the way. So my job is I go out and I say, listen, this guy, Sam Harris, is wrong. He's wrong about the relevant biology. And Sam has now validated that. He went on Rogan. He said, I was wrong about the relevant biology. So now there's two sides to that disagreement. And so there's this question of the relevant biology.
Talking about ego, how funny was that he pretended he didn't know your name?
Oh, it was pathetic.
Oh my God. It was such a poor attempt of trying to minimize,
it's very, Chris Ryan said it very well, which is that, Sam Harris is somebody who's playing high school politics, and he wants to feel smart, and he wants to feel important, he wants to hang with the big kids, and so he has all these people on, right? But the whole time it's pathetic. It's being driven by his ego, and it's being driven by his vanity and his desire to feel important. But for me, mission accomplished. Like, Sam did me a huge favor, because my goal was to draw attention to the relevant biology. So now there's a question. The question is, what is the relevant biology? And I'll tell you right now. It's John Haidt's 2 books. It's David Sloan Wilson's Does Altruism Exist?, which is all about multi-level selection, and then this book, Joe Henrich's The Secret of Our Success. So if you want to understand the controversy, right, that Sam Harris helped create, you can go read those 4 books, right? But you don't even ultimately have to go and read those 4 books, because what Mixed Mental Arts is going to be doing is breaking down those ideas and making it super accessible through the Mixed Mental Arts belt system.
I think, and that's super needed, because there are people like myself who sometimes will get lost in the conversation. Like, the stuff that they're referring, I'm just not familiar with, which makes me lost in this conversation, makes me hard to hold on to it and really understand what's going on. So,
but the point is that the job of an educator like me is to connect the dots and to say, it's okay. You haven't read these 4 books, but you can see these effects that we're talking about in the world around you, right? So, in terms of, John Haidt's work on the righteous mind, well, that's one of those 2 books, right? What is the righteous mind? It's people who are fundamentalists, people who are self-righteous. And you can see that righteous minds, people who are like, I have it all figured out, I'm the authority, you can see that they exist in all tribes. And you can see that the issue is not what particular ideology that they're in, it's the psychology. And you don't even have to go to politics or religion, right? You can go to, I was having this conversation yesterday with Jenkins B. Jennings about comic books. And he was like, when I was in high school, I was like, the jocks are dicks. And he's like, that's why I'm drawn to this other tribe of comic books, which is fun, I want that experience of fun and inclusivity. And then he went to Comic-Con. Right? And he went to this big sort of Comic-Con thing they have here in Rhode Island. And he was like, man, they're assholes. There are a lot of self-righteous assholes who are all about oh, you don't know this obscure cosplay character and I do. And the point is that the issue is dicks. There are dicks everywhere. And it doesn't matter what you're a dick about.
A lot of feminists would agree with you.
There you go. But that's the issue, is that it's people who are judgy dicks. And you can do that around sports. You can do that around whatever.
It's funny. I had a similar experience growing up. I remember being Portuguese, playing soccer, and kind of rebelling against that, getting in the metal. Mm-hmm. And then, I hung out with the metal kids and the goth kids and all those kids that were kind of outsiders. And it was funny because, it didn't take long before I realized, I'm like, these guys who are anti this group, because then we had the friends that took it too far. Like, we had the friends who got, just piercings everywhere and tattoos everywhere. And crazy hair and studs everywhere, spikes everywhere. And I'm just like now they're just trying too hard to fit in this group. So it's like, instead of us being like, no, we're in this group because this group's accepting of everybody, and we don't care what you look like. Now you went to the other extreme where you're like, no, I want to be so in this group that I look like this, and I want everybody to know I'm a part of this group and be outrageously in, you know, looking like this, so everybody knows I'm a metalhead, and I dress like this, and I'm just like, so you're just like rebelling against one group while joining another group, and it's just
the same thing, and all the time it's people trying to solve some sort of insecurity, and like it's basically trying to deal with ego, right? And you know, what do people really need? It's people need to know, like, you're good, like you're great, like, you know, you're human, and turns out your superpower, same as my superpower, is social intelligence. It's the ability to learn from lots of people. So why don't we just form a group, or lots of groups, or different groups, and they can be under the you know, it can be under, you know, corn or apple or Christianity and the cross, or it can be under the ripple effect, or it can be under mixed mental arts, but it doesn't really matter what the banner is. The real thing is the attitude, and the attitude of like, hey, let's all be explorers. Let's all be tinkerers. Let's all be learning all the time. Let's have fun. And that's the world that we can now have. And, you know, right now, there's a small number of us in lots of different places who operate that way. But if you have a whole world that operates on that, you'd be amazed at what humanity can achieve. We haven't even scratched the surface with what we can achieve. The coolest music, the tastiest food, you know, the most awesome discoveries in terms of science in the natural world, you know, the exploring space, doing all these things. They're the best books, the best stories, the best movies. They're still out there waiting to be made, and we can be the people who make them.
Yeah, and I think that's probably one of the appeals with Rogan's podcast, is the fact that he's willing to even have people on who some people would be like, I can't believe you're even wasting time talking to them. Milo, Steve Crowder. I mean, you know, people that he doesn't necessarily agree with 100%, but he's willing to listen. I mean, I do think sometimes he could probably push back a little more than, you know, and open it. He is very polite, you know, and unless you're talking about...
Well, sometimes. I don't know that, you know, there are certain, again...
But
like,
even him, as much as I love Rogan, and he's the reason I started my podcast, when that Stefan story I told you about, you know, when I'm like, Rogan, what the fuck are you talking about? I'm like, Stefan's the one who started a cult, not Peter Joseph. I'm like, Peter Joseph is a very well-spoken person, but he doesn't try to tell people to, like, disconnect from their friends.
Yeah, that's right.
And you know, same thing with yourself. You could see him get defensive when the Sam Harris thing happened.
Of course.
And he went from being, and he's like, well, you know, trying to get, like, well, what do you mean by that? You know, and it's like the way he was saying it, it was like you could tell it was somebody defending their friend, which was completely okay. I get it.
Yep.
But it you know, it kind of took away from the fact that it's like maybe you're making a point that he wasn't picking up on because he was too busy feeling like, hey, I gotta defend my friend because you're on my show, and he's been on this show a bunch of times, and you're saying stuff about him and I'm not a fan of, you know, or maybe it could be, you know, I don't know if this is true or not, but I mean, is it even possible, or did you ever think about this after the show, that could he have felt like you went on his show to try to get attention doing that, and maybe that's what maybe rubbed him the wrong way?
Maybe.
You know, I mean, maybe he's like, oh, this guy's coming on my show to try to get attention by calling somebody out.
I went
in a way you were.
No, that's, I mean, explicitly, like, I made a very conscious decision, right? There was all this science that wasn't moving, that wasn't diffusing, and I was like, how do we get more attention for these ideas? And so, you know, I'd been reading The Diffusion of Innovations, and I'd also been reading The Bully Pulpit. And The Bully Pulpit is all about how Teddy Roosevelt, right? So in terms of Teddy Roosevelt and then a group of journalists known as the Muckrakers, and they were trying to reform society. This was in the progressive era 100 years ago. And so they knew, so for example, they had this problem of monopolies or trusts. And they were like, people can't track this abstract phenomenon of monopolies and trusts. They need something specific to anchor on. So they were like, okay, let's pick one monopoly or trust. So they picked Rockefeller's Standard Oil, and then they were like, let's pick one individual to really track. So it was John D. Rockefeller. And then they were like, we're just going to lay out the story of this person throughout. Now, when I went on Rogan, I figured, okay, let's pick a fundamentalist from each tribe. And so that's what I did. So I had Tom Woods for the anarcho-capitalists, and I had, you know, Lena Dunham, right, for the social justice warriors, right, and her silly comments about cultural appropriation. And I was like, everything is cultural appropriation. That's how food gets innovated, right? Pizza is cultural appropriation. So, you know, and then I had Richard B. Spencer for the alt-right, right? And I had, you know, obviously, like, you didn't even need saying, the Islamic fundamentalists, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi or any of those guys. And, you know, I lined up all these guys. And I'd written, like, a bunch of pieces about all of them to try and show the pattern. But the point is that, you know, Bryan had been trying to get me on Rogan for years. For years he'd been trying to get me on. No dice.
Why?
And what?
Well, why do you think?
Why no dice? Well, I think probably for Rogan, it's like, who is this guy?
But he's had a lot of people like that.
Well, I mean, anyway, for whatever reason, nothing ever happened.
But I guess a lot of the people that he had on that, you know, either he's a fan of their music or he's a fan, he might not have been familiar with your work and, you know, your book.
And even when we talked about the Straight A conspiracy, right, he was like, that's not a problem, right? Like, you know, he was like, oh, people are already dealing with this. And it's like, no, they're not, right? Like, people aren't really dealing with beliefs and emotions and all that sort of stuff. There's like stuff happening around it in education and the diffusion of innovations. He didn't know about that problem. So the point is that for whatever reason, there's context that's needed for Joe to like appreciate what I'm trying to do and why I'm trying to do it. And he didn't have that. But the point is that it was after he was sent that Sam Harris article, or the one about Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, that Rogan like reached out and was like, I read your piece, interesting article, we should get you on the show. And so the point is, in some way, I think I triggered Joe Rogan. Joe Rogan, the man who, you know, did a comedy special about Triggered.
So he wanted to... So it was your piece on Sam Harris that... So he kind of knew your... I mean,
he knew it, which is why he brought it up. He brought it up in the podcast. I wasn't the one who brought it up.
He did bring it up. You're right. Yeah.
And so...
But it's weird that he wasn't better prepared. Because it seems like... It almost seems like...
He thought I wasn't well prepared.
Well... Yeah, I get that, but if you're listening to it, it sounds like he got very defensive.
Yeah.
And my thing is, like, if he already knew that where you stood and the arguments you were going to make, he didn't seem like he was ready to, like, you figure, okay, if you're going on my show to argue with Adam, you know, Kokesh, you know, then you kind of already know, okay, I know where he stands a little bit. I'm ready to kind of share
read
ideas.
His books, you do
you do a little research. You figure, okay, and you figure it'd be much easier to not get so defensive. With him, it almost seemed like he didn't even see it coming, and he got defensive because he's like, oh, you're offending my friend, you know, and or you know, you're talking poorly about my friend, and it's like, well, if he knew it beforehand, I'm just surprised he had that reaction, you know?
Well,
or maybe it was unavoidable because he just still didn't like. But I like the fact that you kind of, you know, the whole podcast wasn't about that. You shared your information, but it's funny how you know, we talked about how people will be very open-minded until you get to that one place where it hits a nerve. With Rogan, it was like that. Like you said, you talked about all these other things, all these other people who were very closed-minded and joined this cult or group or tribe. And then you get to this other person who has all the same symptoms as these other people.
Right.
But yet, because it's his friend, all of a sudden he doesn't see it.
Well, and I mean, you know, in the same way, like, again, the crowd is wise, right? So in the same way that afterwards, you know, we connected and you shared this thing about the Sam Harris, Dan Carlin thing, I've gotten a lot of people who are sharing insights on Rogan, right? That I didn't know, right? Because I haven't watched all 900 episodes of the Rogan episode. You know, 2,700 hours of content, that's a lot of content. But there are people who have, or who have watched near there. And they're like, it's pretty clear. Like, Sam represents what Joe thinks a smart person looks like. And I've watched some of their interactions because I was interested in the social dynamics.
He does that a lot.
Yeah.
Where he puts Sam on this pedestal where he's like, oh, he's so intelligent. He does such a great job just sharing his ideas. And I'm like, kind of. Or maybe he's just so good at not listening to other people and only defending his ideas that he's really thought out 1,000 different ways to say the same thing.
Yeah.
Because that's what he does. He'll just keep repeating the same idea in different ways. That's like, yeah, but... And then he'll use these ridiculous metaphors that, like that's the thing about... And this is the thing. I love the Rogan podcast, but I think when it comes down to anything, I mean, just because you like somebody's show or you like somebody's work doesn't mean you should subscribe to everything they believe or say.
Not.
And even with, you know, and I have friends of mine that'd be like, oh, you disagree with Rogan? I never thought I'd hear you, you know. But it's you know, there are things that you can... It's just so obvious that he puts him on this pedestal. His metaphors, which aren't really good metaphors, that he uses to describe his opinions and perspectives, you know, Rogan just goes, oh yeah, you know, the way he describes things, I'm like, really? Like, it's almost like he you know, and it is, he's a smart guy, you know, you can't say he's a dumb guy. I mean, obviously Sam Harris is at some, I mean, you got to be smart just to be able to defend yourself when you're wrong. You know, I think what's that? Another bad quote. I'll check on that website, but you know, something about
Oldinvestigator.com.
Because the thing about really smart people and really dumb people, the thing that they have in common is they're both really good at convincing themselves that they're right. You know, and one because of lack of information, and one because you have so much information you can cherry pick the information to defend your point. And Sam Harris does that. And I think, you know, you can come off sounding really smart but still be wrong. And you know, well,
but it's what do you track? I mean, this is the thing, is that, you know, what is intelligence? That's the most fundamental thing. And you have to decide what your view of intelligence is before you can then be a smart shopper, right? And so for me, right, intelligence is, you know, the Romans nailed it. The root of intelligence is interlegere, to choose between. So it's the wisdom to know the difference. So the point is that, you know, who is a smart car shopper? Smart car shopper is the person who can tell the difference between a lemon and a good buy, right? And I'm a dumb car shopper, right? I'm going to be buying a secondhand car soon, and you know, I'm doing my best to become a smarter car shopper, but there's a higher chance that I'm going to buy a lemon than somebody who's a much smarter car shopper like Drew Sample, right? Who's hosts the Sample Hour, which is another podcast. So, you know, and that's because Drew has the rules of thumb. He has these little mental tools that he knows what to look for, right? And I've learned some of those. I go, oh, no accidents. Okay, that's a thing. Oh, okay, there's this, there's that, there's that. But, you know, what are people looking for when we're talking specifically about this sort of academic intelligence, right? And most people, what they track is they track fancy piece of paper, right? They're like, oh, you have a fancy piece of paper from the right place, so you must be smart, right? And that's one thing. There's what fancy words you use, how big are the words that you know, and then a lot of it is people are tracking, is they're tracking the social drama, right? You never were wrong, right? And it looks like Sam is never wrong because Sam deflects people's points. He never engages with them. He never says, oh man, you're right, you got me there, right? And he atomizes the point.
And that drives me fucking crazy.
Yeah.
I when I talk to people and they do that, it drives me fucking it's probably one of the things that it's like, I'd rather you just tell me why you think I'm wrong. Like, I'm okay with that. Like, if you can explain why, but to just deflect and then just keep stating how you're right.
That's right.
Like, drives me insane because I'm like, we're not having a conversation.
Yep.
And there's a huge issue with people not knowing how to have an actual conversation and not knowing how to disagree with one another.
That's right.
And
the irony is that I've heard Rogan talk about this a lot. Rogan has talked a lot about people who don't know how to have a conversation, but then he thinks that Sam is really smart when Sam's whole thing is knowing how to avoid a conversation. Right? Sam goes and he does that voice and he talks like this. And then and then what happens is that, you know, he says, okay, we're gonna have a da-da-da. And then Dan Carlin says whatever Dan Carlin says about Iran or whatever, and then Sam just drills down on one little word or one little thing. And then what happens is we've just sort of lost track of what the conversation or the point was. And it seems like Sam beat him, right? Or something like that. And then a lot of what people also track is it's the same thing with the Ben Affleck, Sam Harris thing, right? People are tracking the social drama. Ben Affleck lost his cool, right? Sam maintained his cool. Therefore, Ben Affleck loses. This is how people actually track things, is it's that social intelligence, and they're tracking that social dynamics.
Yeah, and unfortunately him getting emotional, calling him a racist, and, you know, people kind of lost track of what he was trying to say. And,
that's right.
And the thing is, you know, there's a lot of people who believe and people who understand that, like, foreign policy has a big part to do with this. Yeah. And you can't go, you know, it's like the resource curse, you know, they call it, you know, it's like
Dutch oil disease. Sometimes.
Yeah. So it's just one of those things where if you have resources, there's going to be people coming and they're going to be taking it, and you're, you know, and you know, there's a reason.
It's no different than being a sports star and then all the moochers show up, or being a lottery winner and all the moochers show up.
Yeah, all of a sudden you got cousins you've never heard
exactly.
of. Yeah. No, it's absolutely. And so I think that's a huge issue. But in some cases, you know, I've seen Joe, you know, like Steve Crowder, for example, or even when Stefan was on his show last and they got in a argument about, you know, what Stefan has said or what he believes and whatnot, like, where he can keep his cool too, and he can share ideas and stuff. But then I think when it comes down to a friend of his, you know, somebody who's he seems to be actually close with Sam, it's much harder for him to disregard his emotions and just
Of
have
course.
a disagreement, you know.
But see-
or even with the weed thing with Steve Crowder, it
Yeah.
seems like weed is the topics that it's much easier to get Rogan to get worked up about. So because of that, and even Steve said it, even though I think Steve's wrong and he's an idiot, he is right where where it is one of those many topics Joe might not push back on, where when it comes down to weed, he's more likely to argue about. And
But see, Joe, the great thing is that what all this comes down to is that Joe has his principle. And Joe has articulated this principle of Joe Rogan questions everything. And Joe's whole brand is based on Joe Rogan questions everything and him being curious, right? And then there are times when he doesn't live that, right? So he didn't...
Well, there's a lot of people who are giving him shit in regards to, because he used to be much more curious before and ask. I mean, even though he, the Bigfoot thing, the moon landing and stuff, but that's all fine. Like, I don't think there's anything wrong with asking those questions. Like, he got shit when he had Neil deGrasse Tyson on the first time, and they got in a little discussion about it, and Joe kind of like strayed away from it and let Neil deGrasse say some things, and it just seems like he was purposely not pushing back because he didn't want to, and it seems like he's gotten away from.
Because Joe is intimidated. What this is all about
You think so?
I think Joe is intellectually intimidated by a certain kind of academic intellectual.
Well, is it intimidation, or is it the fact that, like, for example, if I am talking to a mechanic and he's fixing my car, like, I know a little bit about cars, but I assume he's going to know much more than me. Similar, okay, but better example, you, with education.
Right.
I'm going to state my opinion on why I think maybe I struggled to be, to keep my attention in school. That's going to be my opinion. But because you have a history of teaching and analyzing kids and interacting with that whole world, I'll respect your opinion a little more, and I'll be similar to the Cowspiracy podcast we're talking about. He didn't push back with some of those statistics that he thought maybe was incorrect because he wasn't sure if he was right or if they were wrong or whatnot, so he kind of held back. And maybe that could be it. Maybe it could be
a lack of knowledge, right?
So when you have somebody you
have
have somebody in the public eye who's like, okay, this is an expert in this field, I think he's wrong, but I also don't want to look like an idiot and state something that I'm not sure of. And if it's my word against his, I'm going to assume he did more research than me. He probably knows this information better than me, so I'm going to take his word for it. I've done it. Well, I've done it where I've done it tons of times where I have somebody had said something that I in the back of my head I know they're wrong, but I'm not sure, and I can't pinpoint or reference the information to remember a different statistic or different whatever it may be, and I'm like, but I'm not going to say anything. I'm not going to say anything because I can't remember what was it that I read that contradicted what they said. And because of it, I'll just let them talk, or I'll be like, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I misread that, maybe I misunderstood, and then I'll read something again. I'll like, let me research this, and I'll be like, holy shit, I was right. I didn't, but because of some maybe some insecurities with my memory or my intellect, I'm gonna take their word for it at the moment, and maybe that's a part of it. When somebody's an expert in a field, which I guess what the fuck does that even mean, really? But if you're an expert in a field, then you're just gonna, if you're unsure, you're less likely to bring it up than if they were talking to somebody who wasn't an expert in the same field. If I'm talking to you about the moon landing.
See, what is that about, right? Like,
so I guess I'm making your point.
Yeah, the point is that that's about like, oh, I don't feel confident here. I'm a little bit intimidated. Especially if you're like a big fancy poobah and you have like this.
You're so smart that you got me to argue with you, then come around and not even realize I was making your point.
Well, that's the Chinese principle, I think, Isaiah Guli would say, of Wu Wei, right? So the point is that I redirect your own force against you, right? I don't fight you.
Halfway through my rant, I'm like, I'm pretty sure I'm making this fucking point. What am I saying?
But whatever it is, and like, it's important to remember that we're speculating here on people who aren't here, right?
Yeah,
Sam isn't here, Joe isn't here, none of these people are here. The Cowspiracy guys, they're not here, right? But
they're making sheepspiracy.
Yeah, exactly. But I think that this is all speculation. But I think what this all teaches me, and what I think is great about this is this is a thing that happened 6 to 8 months ago, and people keep bringing it up. They keep bringing it up. And that's what, I sort of got from the bully pulpit and from reading Joe Henrich's The Secret of Our Success, is that what you have to do is you have to create social drama that people find fascinating, because people are trying to solve that social drama. They're like, what was that about? Why did that happen? I'm trying to make sense of this. But ultimately, in order to make sense of that social drama, you have to get into the argument. You have to get into the ideas. So now we have to start thinking about all of this stuff about fundamentalism and righteous minds and, tribes and how different tribes operate and the same social dynamics operate. And that ultimately, the goal is not that, oh my God, now we've realized that the ripple effect is the be-all and the end-all. Well, because or mixed metal arts or whatever it is, the real point is to
get... Yeah, we want to be the cult leader. We just...
No, and
we do want to bang other people's wives.
That is what we want to do, but then our own wives slap us and get in trouble. So, but what we want is, to create a ripple, right? And to get people seeking. And I have enough faith that if everybody is seeking and everybody is asking these questions and everybody is doing that ultimately the hive mind will sort it out. But the main thing is to get people out of their rigid ideologies and get them wondering, what is that person's point? What is going on with there? And one of the effects that I've noticed is that people keep telling me, hey, because of you, I've started listening to Waking Up podcast with Sam Harris. And I'm like, that's cool with me. Like, that's what I want. I want you to go and check out all of these people and see and test and for you to be on your own journey. I'm not worried about... The thing that worries me is not when people are, going and exploring lots of ideas. It's when they're not.
Yeah.
And
that's what, that one thing that I kind of, I don't know why I'm like this or how I picked up on it at such a young age, but being curious, one thing that always seemed interesting to me, that I always seem to do a good job of looking at a bunch of shit and then maybe not completely remembering the specifics, but remembering the which part of it made sense, and and letting that mold my overall opinion, perspective, and who I am, and I think that's really, like you said, that's what being
curious.
Curious.
You're on a journey.
Yeah, and being smart. I mean, a lot of times people, like you said, I think, and you talked about it with Brett Veinotte, which I think was really fascinating and something that I think is absolutely true, and is the fact that we all agree that school is just you memorizing and regurgitating names and dates and information, but you sit down and I think that's why some people say book smart and street smart. What you're really saying is that this person who's street smart, who maybe doesn't have the diploma or whatnot, but yet had to grow up in a tougher environment, so he had to problem solve, had to figure shit out, critical thinking skills, he seems smarter, and this person who's book smart literally is only smart when they're, or only sound smart when they're talking about this specific names and dates and facts and research that they memorized to pass the test.
Intelligence is entirely environment dependent, right? So it's take a guy from the Amazon, put him in New York City. He's fucked. He instantly becomes dumb as shit. Take a guy from New York City and put him in the Amazon. He's fucked. He's instantly dumb as shit. It's entirely...
Does that Amazon have Wi-Fi?
Are we talking about Amazon the company or Amazon the rainforest?
You're right. I've never even thought about it like that.
It's the simplest way to be able to quickly just clarify. All intelligence is environment dependent, and it's that intelligence is cultural software that you've downloaded from your tribe.
But it's also, like you said before.
By the way, I really need to go to the bathroom.
Yeah, no problem.
So we can pause, but
What's up, guys? We end up cutting it right there. Thanks a lot for listening. Hopefully the quality was good enough where you could enjoy the conversation and really hear things without... I know at times there was annoying hiss and stuff in the background. I try to clean it up. If by any chance I do end up messing around with it and cleaning up any more, then I'll just upload it onto the RSS feed and I'll notify you in a future podcast that we end up having a cleaner version. But for now, hopefully this was more than listenable. And remember to support the show, Patreon, share it, tweet it, do all that stuff. And also look out for the podcast with Hunter Maats and Adam Kokesh. We're going to have a friendly roundtable debate. So thanks again, guys, for listening. Truly appreciate it. And like I said, rate the show, tweet the show, do all that stuff. And this show and any other show you like. And it's your way of helping spread the ripple. So thanks, and I'll see you on the next one.
Believe in the ripple effect.